there online. It's out there probably in the halls of Congress. It's out there in many drawing rooms in the United States and Bangladesh and elsewhere. We don't have an agenda in terms of pushing forward any political party, any Bangladesh entity, any American entity. We're here to provide information. So I'm confident that from our panelists, we hear a diversity of views, and that's a good thing. So if our panelists take a slightly different perspective on issues, you can tell that we're doing what we wanted to do. And it should go without saying, but I have no idea what any of the panelists were going to say. There was a time when I might have had some influence on what Dan Mazzino would say in public, but those days are long behind us. So both Dan and I, as retired diplomats, have the opportunity to speak our own minds and not worry so much about what the U.S. government wants us to say, because neither of us speak for the U.S. government. And for that matter, none of the panelists are speaking on behalf of any of the organizers. I think they'll tell you as well, they don't necessarily speak on behalf of the institutions or the organizations with which they're affiliated. What we've brought together is a group of really smart people who know Bangladesh well and care about Bangladesh to share some views. Farhana Sultana will go over kind of the run of show when she gets up here. But without further ado, I want to invite Rashid Tanvir Islam to the podium to introduce Congressman Doggett. So Rashid.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank all of you, and especially the organizers, to make this event possible. It's very important that we, look back after what happened, last July, as part of our monsoon revolution and where we are today. And I'm looking forward to having great conversations and the panel discussions. As a constituent of Congressman Doggett's district, and also a member of BRAIN, it's a personal privilege and honor for me to introduce him. I know Lloyd for a long period of time, and especially through the events and the activities that we do in local organization, Bangladesh Association of Greater Austin, and we had the privilege of having Dan there for a while back. Lloyd and his team has been tremendously supportive of our organization, and especially our diaspora. Whenever you ask the office, for smaller needs, for our constituent in terms of immigration, in terms of venue, in terms of, major issues that arise in our community, he's always been there. He and Libby always attends our events. And, with special Bangladeshi attire, he was there in our Poila Boishakh event about a month ago. But one thing that, we saw his genuine care about our organization and our people is last year during the July, monsoon revolution, when our student organization from all of the universities in Texas asked him to support. When we had a huge rally in the state capitol, his office helped us, make sure that everything goes well. And then, since then, I think most of you have seen his tweets. He was very vocal from the beginning, taking on the fascist regime, all the bad tactics and undemocratic norms that they were practicing. And he was forefront. And the voice on those tweets has been amazing and galvanized us to be organized and then to protest all of those, terrible things that happened and resulting in too many deaths. But fortunately, we were successful, and that's because of the support from Lloyd and his office, and similar support from our elected officials. So without further ado, Lloyd, thank you so much for being here, and helping. Your office was instrumental in getting us this venue and facilitating what we have today. So I appreciate it, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Delighted to join you this morning, and while there are a lot of other things going on here in Congress that will pull me out of the session in a little while, Sarah Engelhard from my office will be here and has been very involved in this. It is good to see advocates, congressional staff members, and those who care about what's happening on the other side of the earth. I was drawn to this cause because, though I'm very provincial, having only lived in one city all my life, I know that city has been strengthened by its ability to draw the best and brightest from all over the world, of which I have seen firsthand, as with my friend Rashid and a number of other members of the community, how much they have added and strengthened and made my hometown a much better place. Our countries have a history of some shared values and shared concerns, whether it's with trade, with climate, security and development goals. And I believe that one of the gifts that I got from Rashid was a Shahid Minar symbol, a copy of the monument that is in Dhaka. And it was also a reminder, as I see it each day, that since 50 or so years back, there have been people in Bangladesh, in that case, some massacred because of their defense of the Bengali language by Pakistanis, who have been seeking freedom, seeking the same kind of rights we expect to have here in America. And I believe our objective from gatherings like this is to remain committed to fully achieving the democratic promise that has been sought and not fully fulfilled for so long in Bangladesh. We know many of the details, and thanks to Right to Freedom for the role that you played in the effort to prevent a tyrannical ruler from engaging in tactics that favored her party and her clique to the detriment of so many others. I think for about 15 years, Bangladeshis saw corruption in plain sight. They saw security forces committing human rights violations with impunity, and their government making a mockery of elections. So it's no surprise that many people who could not find an economic opportunity for themselves, who, when they graduated or were nearing graduation, could not find a job, were outraged by the quota system that was being reinstated despite their repeated protests. Ordinary citizens were able to accomplish something rather extraordinary that has happened in few other places on the earth in recent times, but at an enormous price. We can't forget the image of Abu Sayed, probably not saying it right, with his arms outstretched, and reminds us of after Tiananmen Square, that courageous person in the PRC standing in front of a tank. But the deaths there and the UN estimates that about 1,400 people may have been killed, many of them children, are troubling, as are the kidnappings and the torture with electric shocks and beatings that occurred throughout that time. This brutality of Sheikh Hasina did not intimidate people into silence, and it's really impressive how they flooded the streets and eventually forced her to flee. Hearing from Bangladeshi Texans, as Rashid said, and I think this probably happened in many other cities across America, that in a place as far from Dhaka as Austin, Texas, there were a large number of Bangladeshi Texans and allies who were at our state capitol to say we can stand for no more of this. Following that, and as a result of that, contacted the State Department and was joined, and I'm pleased we're joined this morning by my friend Jim McGovern, who heads our human rights efforts here. Several of us. I think there may have been a little more interest there in maintaining close relations with India than in recognizing the sacrifice that was being made by young Bangladeshis. And while I think our country has a great interest in having India as a counterbalance to a very aggressive PRC, our policies in that region in South Asia and beyond cannot be so narrowly focused that the only thing that matters is what New Delhi thinks. 30 years ago, when I first came to Congress, one of the first caucuses I joined was the India caucus. But I'm increasingly concerned about the Modi government, its discrimination against, its attacks on the Muslim members of this community. When I joined the India caucus, the pride was in the diversity in the country and the strength that India gets from that diversity. But what we've seen in recent years from the BJP has been a policy that I view as completely contrary to that. The Trump administration, with its closure last Friday of the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department, has indicated how little it cares about human rights in our international policies. But those of us, whether in elected office or otherwise, who have been human rights advocates, have all the more reason to speak out forcefully. You indicated that there would be a diversity of views. I'm very direct about this and what it means for our country. A prominent protest leader I saw recently, Nahid Islam, said that over the last 15 years, people couldn't talk. Now they finally get a chance. And what we should be about is giving and having policies that encourage Bangladeshis to take that chance and to secure the democracy and the freedoms that they have not been able to fully experience in the past. The Commission on Inquiry and Enforced Disappearance was rightfully extended, and it's important, I think, that India continue to be called upon to extradite Hasina for proper sentencing and being held accountable for her crimes. It's also important that the Modi government not interfere in Bangladeshi affairs. Strengthening the country's rule of law and its institutions are, of course, benefiting greatly from having a distinguished leader in Dr. Mohammed Yunus. He has rightfully worked with all parties to try, with this July charter, to try to move Bangladesh toward elections next year. I hope that can happen and that the foundation has been laid for more genuine democracy. Another very great concern, along with this journey that we honor today, is the role of trade between our two countries. And that's also recently faced some setbacks. I may have brought you a new title here with the computer, but I don't think we have trade there yet. But Bangladesh is the third largest trading partner, trading exporter of apparel to this country, and it relies we rely on apparel from there, and it is in Bangladesh that something like 80% of all export earnings are related to apparel, constituting about 10% of the entire gross domestic product of the country. We have been the largest foreign direct investor in Bangladesh and its largest export market. The Court of International Trade rightly ruled that the fact that Americans buy more goods from Bangladesh, and we sell certainly a great deal there, that there's not a national emergency, as the President declared, with reference to our trading relations with Bangladesh. After promising 90 trade deals in 90 days, failing to produce only 2 very incomplete deals, President Trump is now setting this August 1st deadline for imposing more tariff taxes on Americans and limiting and adversely affecting the exports coming out of Bangladesh. I don't believe that anyone can win a trade war, and we certainly are not winning that war. We're simply imposing more taxes and higher prices on American citizens and threatening some of our best allies. This threat to impose a 35% tariff on Bangladesh in particular in 2 weeks is something that will have the effect, if it stays in effect, of destroying the garment sector and the thousands of people in Bangladesh that rely on that. Not dissimilar from the tragedy around the world from the termination of the United States Agency for International Development. I believe that it employed tens of thousands of Bangladeshis who lost their job, and the country losing $700 million in really critical development assistance. Young people, not only in Bangladesh, but in many other parts of the world, are dead today because of that abrupt termination. I've sponsored legislation joining with Jim on Congressional Authority over Trade, which needs to be reestablished, consistent with what the courts have ruled, and hoping that the Senate this week will reject the rescissions on foreign assistance programs. Bangladeshis have been also leaders with good reason on climate diplomacy, something that is still being denied at the White House. The administration's firing here of top scientists, its degradation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Weather Service, the latter having its impact near my home in Austin just this past couple of weeks with the intense flooding and the very late announcements and warnings about it. All of this related to our collective battle against the climate crisis, which is very real. In fact, we can feel it today in D.C. Bangladesh, of course, is very vulnerable to rising sea levels, to storms that have previously led to the deaths of so many people there from flooding. By 2050, it's estimated that 1 in every 7 people in Bangladesh will be displaced by climate change. They'll be among the climate refugees that are likely to plague the world. So after the hottest year on record in the world, the heat waves that are now flooding the Northeast and Europe and all around the world mean we need climate action. And it was good that it was Bangladesh action in the UN Human Rights Commission recently that led to a resolution which was approved, simplify procedures for developing countries to access global climate funds, of which we need so much more. Finally, I would say that what happened in Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina is also a roadmap to what we want to avoid here in the United States. We've long taken pride in the fact that we are the world's longest democracy, most historic democracy. But I personally saw here on January 6th that democracy is not guaranteed, that we have a responsibility to engage just as people in Bangladesh engaged to ensure that democracy is guaranteed. So many of the practices that I've seen in recent months, whether it's ignoring courts, ignoring the Congress, dismissing the ethics office and the inspector general that are our watchdogs over federal agencies, the pardoning of the January 6 felons, and a concerted effort for one-man interference in rule of our country is a reminder that we need to stand firm for our democracy and for our civil liberties and not see the undermining of democracy. So many Americans, certainly any who have a green card, but most particularly my Republican colleagues, are intimidated by what's happening in our country. But there are many Bangladeshis that are every bit as American as I am. And I think it's very important that they participate, just like every other citizen, in speaking out and resisting tyranny. So much of what the mass movement did last July that we honor here today is what we need to continue. Truth on social media, protesting in peaceful ways to demonstrate that America will not accept autocracy, and demanding accountability from elected officials of both parties at every level of government. Of course, the most effective check will be getting a Democratic House next year that has the power of subpoena and the ability to influence what's happening on appropriations at home and abroad. With 3 new members, we get there. And one of the leaders in our effort that I'm pleased to share this part of our program with, as I mentioned, is my friend Jim McGovern. Jim is from the Boston area. He is the top Democrat, not only in charge of human rights, our Lantos human rights effort here, but the top Democrat on the Rules Committee. And next year, when we have a Democratic majority come in, he's the one who will be playing the key role in setting the terms for the debate of every piece of legislation that comes before the House. I'm pleased to call him a friend and someone I admire and look up to on human rights issues, Jim McGovern. Jim, come on up. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Congressman Doggett, and you've also made my job a little easier. Congressman Doggett, we just want to present you with a small token and a reminder of the events of last July. Great.
Thank you very much.
So today is a very special day for me for many reasons. But one reason is that it's a rare opportunity for me to have the opportunity to introduce a fellow alumni of my alma mater, Burncoat Elementary School in Worcester, Massachusetts. Congressman McGovern has been my congressman representing the 2nd District of Massachusetts since 1996. He is a global leader working to end hunger, protect human rights, and promote peace around the world. As Congressman Doggett has mentioned, he is the co-chair of the bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. which played a critical role in the United States during the pro-democracy, anti-fascism movement in terms of raising awareness and providing a platform for people who otherwise didn't have a voice. His commitment to human rights that goes back even before his time as a member of Congress, when he worked on congressional staff. Those of you of my generation and before will remember the tragic events in Central America during the 1980s and the 1990s. As a congressional staffer, Congressman McGovern led an investigation into the murders of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter. This was an example of how human rights advocacy can lead to real changes, as this profoundly influenced U.S. policy towards Central America. Jim, if I can call you Jim, has been a great friend of Bangladesh. He's been a great congressman for the 2nd District of Massachusetts and has been a strong, consistent voice during the pro-democracy movement and in favor of stronger relations between the U.S. and Bangladesh. So with that, Congressman McGovern.
Well, good morning, everybody, and I want to thank John for the incredible introduction and the nice build-up. I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say after that introduction. But John holds many distinguished titles. He's the president of Right to Freedom, a former Foreign Service officer, but most importantly, he's my constituent. And so it's really a delight to see him and to be introduced by him. I also want to acknowledge Representative Doggett, a member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and a stalwart ally in the fight to promote human rights abroad. One of the things that I admire most about Lloyd Doggett is he has the courage of his convictions. He kind of tells it like it is, and he's not afraid to stand up and to defend the human rights of people, not just halfway around the world, but also halfway down the block. And we need more members like him, and I hope we'll get them. The Tom Lantos Commission has, which I co-chair, has evaluated conditions in Bangladesh for many times over the years. And some of you are familiar faces, because I know you've been at some of these hearings. In 2017, we highlighted the widespread displacement and human rights violations suffered by Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State. In 2018, we examined how the government's targeting of political opposition groups and proponents of free speech threaten to shutter civil society and increase extremism. In 2023, we turned our attention to the journalists and government critics being surveilled and attacked in advance of the 2024 elections. There are rays of hope today that I didn't see then, quite frankly. A little over a year ago, students took to the streets of Dhaka to demand an end to the unjust civil service job quota. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, whose 15 years in power were marked by enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings, directed security forces to deploy lethal force against them. The UN Human Rights Office reports that more than 1,400 were killed in relation to that protest. And, when we talk about numbers like 1,400, they seem so outrageous that sometimes I think people cannot appreciate, what they really mean. And I know that for some of you, this is not just a number. It represents parents, children, friends, and neighbors. And I stand with you as you mourn those that you lost. The formation of the interim government under Nobel laureate Dr. Muhammad Yunus marked a turning point. It signaled a clear commitment to democratic reform and justice. And for the first time in many years, there is a real prospect for accountable governance and the restoration of fundamental freedoms. The interim government is navigating enormous challenges, rebuilding institutions hollowed out by authoritarianism, pursuing justice for past abuses, and restoring public trust. These tasks are daunting on their own, and without sustained international support, they become almost impossible. When the Trump administration dismantled USAID, over 100 development and humanitarian projects in Bangladesh were forced to scale down or to shut down. Last year, the U.S. contributed 55% of all foreign aid for Rohingya refugees. Now Rohingya refugees are less certain when they will get their next meal or a doctor's visit. And across sectors, including health, agriculture, and good governance, many organizations are struggling to stay afloat precisely when their work matters the most. So the United States cannot afford to just sit on the sidelines. We must re-engage through development assistance, technical support for judicial reform and election integrity, and efforts to combat disinformation. You know, whether from a grand strategy perspective or a human rights one, it is in our interest to do so. You know, we must also be clear-eyed about what's at stake. What Bangladesh does next will not only shape the future of its 170 million people, it will send a signal to the region and the world about whether peaceful democratic transitions can succeed in the face of repression. And what the United States does next will define how credible we are when we talk about human rights abroad. You know, one of the things that worries me deeply about the current administration here in Washington is that human rights seem to be put on the back burner. And I've always felt that if the United States of America stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. I think that's what makes us unique in the eyes of the world community. People are depending on us. People want us to support their efforts for freedom and for democracy and for human rights. And when you've got agencies in the State Department that are committed to human rights, it sends a very bad signal. When you cut development aid and when you cut aid to refugees, it sends a bad signal that somehow we're retreating from those commitments, that somehow they don't matter as much anymore. And I think this is a critical time here in the United States, as Congressman Doggett pointed out. And so part of our job is to not just talk about what needs to be done in Bangladesh, but to make sure that we don't see the dismantling of agencies and institutions and departments and funding mechanisms that are designed to be part of the solution. So I want to thank Right to Freedom. I want to thank Bangladesh America Alliance and Bangladesh Research Analysis and Information Network for all of the hard work that you're doing to support Bangladesh as it rebuilds its democracy. I look forward to continuing to work together. I hope that you will stay in touch with us and the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission to make sure that we have the most up-to-date information, that if there were emergency situations that arise, that you call us so we can work with you to respond to them. But we will be there for you. I mean, we will have your back. We're not going away. But and you know, I'll just close with this. You know, I wear these Tibetan prayer beads that were given to me by His Holiness the Dalai Lama when I met with him a little over a year ago. And he gave them to me and he blessed them to me. And he said that they're to help me deal with my negativity and my fear and my concern and my worries. They're not working. I think I need beads for this hand, and probably around my neck too. Look, there are a lot of challenges in the world today. There are a lot of challenges in Bangladesh, and we have some real challenges here in the United States. And what I worry about sometimes is that it can seem overwhelming, and people can feel hopeless and helpless and wonder whether or not we can make any progress. I continue to be hopeful. I mean, and there are some signs of hope in Bangladesh, as I pointed out. We can't give up. You know, we may not be able to change the past, but we all can help shape the future. And so I look forward to working with you. And again, thank you for welcoming me here today, and I wish you a great day with your conference. Thank you.
Move this way. Sorry. This is obligatory photo op. A gift bag that we have.
I will probably display it in my office. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman McGovern, for those inspiring and hopeful words. We're going to shift gear now and get into the next part of the program. Professor Farhana Sultana, who's going to be moderating the next panel, will give us a brief overview. But before we go forward, I just want to recognize the Charge d'Affaires of the Bangladesh Embassy in Washington, Salahuddin Mahmood, who's here in the front row. Without being partisan, suffice to say that if we had held this event a year ago, I don't think we'd have any representatives of the Bangladesh Embassy sitting in the front row. So while this is an independent event that these organizations are holding, this is not an event on behalf of the government of Bangladesh. We're so pleased to have Salahuddin here, and we're so pleased to see his embassy working so hard in Washington to tell Bangladesh's story. We miss Ambassador Assad, who's back in Dhaka, busy at work as Foreign Secretary, but we're very happy to have representatives of the Bangladesh Embassy here today.
And thank you for letting us borrow the flag.
Yeah, thank you. That was a nice touch. So with that, I'll hand it over to Farhana. What I would just say too, we're among friends here, so this is a casual group. If anyone needs to step out during the program, feel free to, excuse yourself and come back when you can.
Morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. We've got feedback that some folks on the live stream are having difficulty hearing, so I'm just going to elevate my voice a little bit. So those of you who are in the room, hello, and thank you for showing up and going through the hassle of giving us your morning. And those who are watching live stream or in recording later on, thank you for joining us from far and wide and virtually and in the future. I'm Farhana Sultana. I'm a professor in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs of Syracuse University. I'm also the co-chair of the Bangladesh America Alliance, which is one of the co-organizers of this event today. And if you hadn't figured out, I was probably in Bangla, what is called the Madborni, the one who drove this from the beginning. So I had to throw in the Bangla. I don't know what the equivalent in English is, but we'll leave that much for humor for this morning. I want to thank Representative Lloyd Doggett for sponsoring the event and for his welcoming remarks, and for Representative Jim McGovern for his kind comments, and also the historical overview that each of them provided. And in terms of a quick overview, which is my goal today, I would like to highlight a couple of things. So we have two excellent panels that will go back to back with a 5-minute break in the middle, in which time you can use the restroom or get some tea or coffee. I ask you to please, everyone, silence your phones if you can. Our speakers in the panel come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and they will share their expertise and experiences on a range of topics on Bangladesh as we mark this 1-year anniversary. What we call the July Revolution, another July has come. And yet, what have we accomplished? What are the challenges? What are the risks and pitfalls? What are the hopes and aspirations and possibilities and accomplishments? Little known or well celebrated. Those are the kinds of issues that we're going to try to touch upon. And as a result, our goal is to better inform those who care about Bangladesh or who don't, who would like to learn more, who would like to be more informed in a much more kind of nonpartisan, in a rigorous way that covers a range from academia to policy to law to activism to advocacy and so on. Our hope is that we can inform and urge continued U.S. support for Bangladesh's fledgling democracy, And the program you have at hand highlights the topics and the speakers in the two panels. And those who are following online, the entire event's program and the live streaming and press release and the press briefing that will be held tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. All that information is available on the event page, which is at bdusalliance.org/DC, I think DC event 2025. You can figure it out. It's not hard. But it's all there on social media as well. So after the two panels are completed, so this is what we're doing in terms of the overall structure for the rest of the day. There will be a very quick summary and key takeaways, followed by a vote of thanks, and then we will conclude. And we invite you to stay through the morning, and we'll have a light lunch, more like refreshments, but you'll use that hour to network, get to know each other, and that is also an opportunity for everyone to ask further questions of the panelists and to engage with various speakers who may not be at the panels but have spoken before or after. And we invite you to network, get to know each other, share your business cards if you've got it. If not, there's, a piece of paper. One housekeeping rule that we are going to follow for the panels is that we will have a roving volunteer who will pick up questions. We're asking you to please submit questions in writing. Everyone was given a notepad and a pen at registration. You were wondering why you're given a notepad and a pen. Now you know. So you can take notes and you can submit questions in writing. You can rip out the paper and hand it to our roving volunteer. We'll bring it up front. Because we're short on time, this is why we're going to maximize it. But we're happy to speak to everyone over lunch. So that's kind of the overview in terms of, me emceeing, just very generally. So I'd like to start with the first panel. It is my pleasure to say I'm actually moderating the first panel. So this is why we set it up this way. And it is called the Lessons from the July Uprising. So I'm going to go ahead and just give the rationale for it and also invite our panelists up front in just a second. So 1 year ago, in the blazing heat of July, a people's uprising overthrew an entrenched autocracy in Bangladesh. What began as a student protest quickly grew to a nationwide movement that we all know, but it was a diverse, multi-generational, and truly popular uprising. Unarmed civilians led by students who refused to accept the brutal and corrupt regime filled the streets of the capital Dhaka and beyond. The regime responded with lethal violence, as you all know or have heard just this morning, resulting in over 1,400 deaths. And it is not just the number, but it is the time within which it occurred, 3 weeks. 1,400 deaths of young people in 3 weeks. And then thousands more injured and maimed. Yet the students and their supporters stood firm, managing to bring down a powerful and corrupt regime that had foreign support. The role of the diaspora, many of you who are in the room and away from us, but joining us in spirit, were there with our students on the streets in that moment. And that support was vital. Across continents, Bangladeshis mobilized, protesting, countering propaganda, pressuring foreign governments to condemn and investigate the regime's violence, and sharing footage and testimony from those inside the country. While those on the ground risked everything on the streets, those outside worked tirelessly to ensure the world paid attention. Their shared struggle created a sense of national solidarity across generations, geographies, and political divides. For many in the diaspora, the July Revolution actually marked a turning point in much more engaged civic engagement, which led to today's events, in case you're wondering why this long beginning. I'm getting there. So what led to this co-organized event is groups of diaspora and allies and those who care about Bangladesh or have worked in Bangladesh came together to make sure that we commemorated the 1 year anniversary of the July Revolution, but also took stock of what's happening on the ground. So the energy that galvanized protests and policy briefings are evolving now into much more deeper engagement, right? People are much more politically involved in country and abroad. And those collaborations, and it's rarely single-handed, the collaborations we're seeing end up sharing knowledge, building partnerships, spur on technical assistance, legal support, and cultural work. The diaspora and supporters of democracy must continue to advocate for the people of Bangladesh, not for the interests of faction and individuals, but for a vision of a country where governance is truly accountable to its citizens and truly serves them. The hard work of rebuilding strong democratic institutions, ensuring justice, safeguarding the rights of all has only just begun, and that is what we cover in this first panel. But we know that political transitions are fragile. Without consistent pressure, consistent resources, collective effort, we see that autocratic tendencies that were overthrown may resurface in a new form. Over the last year, many worked to highlight Bangladesh's democratic struggles so that they're not forgotten or misunderstood amidst the vast disinformation campaigns against Bangladesh that were rife and still continue. So in today's event, our goal is to emphasize the importance of supporting democratic transitions in the country and upholding principles of justice, accountability, and civil rights. In this first panel, before I introduce our panelists, we want to highlight that promoting democracy in Bangladesh and human rights while trying to stabilize the economy and handle geopolitical pressures are challenging in a post-revolutionary context. So I want to that was the precursor, or rather the way to overview what we're going to cover, but each panelist covers very different items to build off of this. They will cover a range of issues from what happened in July, what aspirations there were, what reforms are being met, the roles of different and new players in the political landscape, and the prospects of sustained and improved governance and social flourishing that really takes into account human dignity. So I invite now our panel one panelist. Please come on up. So let me now introduce our panelists. We all here? Yes, we're all here. And hopefully everyone can still see us, right? We're a bit seated. But so we have 4 panelists. Unfortunately, as you know, there were thunderstorms in DC last night and many flights got canceled. So one of our panelists' flight was canceled, unfortunately, but he has sent in his bullet points that we will kind of cover. I'll try to, say what, I won't say it as well as he said it, but I will like to acknowledge what he said. So our first speaker will be, and I'll introduce each person and then they'll take their 6 minutes. I've given them 6 to 7 minutes, and then we can quickly move on to your written questions, and then, we can hopefully have a nicer conversation. So Orani Samanti Khan, a lecturer at Jagannath University in Dhaka, who is currently pursuing a PhD in Florida State University, took place in the July uprising last year, and is a member of the University Teachers Network, which is a platform for nonpartisan faculty members united for social causes in Bangladesh. He has been a rights activist since her student days and have contested the 2019 Dhaka University Central Students' Union election as part of a nonpartisan independent student alliance. Next would have been Islamul Haq, but let me just quickly say who he is, even though he's not here. He's a development economist who is currently a postdoc at Yale University and got his PhD in economics from the University of Southern California. He has been working with the Nagarik Commission in Bangladesh that was created in post-revolution landscape and is focusing on reforms. Next, we have Catherine Cooper, who is here with us. She is an attorney at the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, where she coordinates the human rights work in South and Southeast Asia with a focus on Bangladesh and Myanmar. Catherine joined RFK Human Rights from Georgetown Law, where she taught human rights law and advocacy, and she previously served as an international legal advisor at Justice Base in Yangon, Myanmar. She received her JD from Harvard Law School. Last but not least, we have Veena M. Siddiqui, who is a clinical professor in liberal arts at New York University in New York City, who is a cultural anthropologist by training with a PhD from University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her research joins critical development studies, transnational feminist theory, and anthropology of Islam and labor, primarily in Bangladesh, where she has published extensively on garment supply chains, human rights, gender, and nationalism. Each panelist, again, has been advised to keep their comments to about 6 to maximum 7 minutes to allow for more time for discussion and Q&A. And what we're going to do is basically go ahead and get started. And when it comes to Islamul's time, I will just highlight some of the points that he wanted everyone to be aware of. And there will be volunteers in the room who take the questions at the end. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Aruni, if you want to speak for about 6 minutes.
Greetings, everyone. I could greet everyone with a good morning, but when I look back to the experience from a year ago, the things that I have to talk about, the experiences from July and the lessons learned, well, it has just been a year, and I'm thinking about the lessons learned. Still think about the experiences that not necessarily me. I believe I have been privileged, or I have been protected by my peers or the people I've been with. I have not, I personally have not faced violence, but a friend who was just there with me in the morning, we have been in demonstrations, just like on the 18th of July, 2024. He was killed, and I was just beside that person. So the only things after a year, I've written so much stuff down. Like there's so many lessons that we should be taking note of. But now I wasn't. This wasn't in the schedule. When I'm trying to remember. So into a year of July, thinking about the experiences is painful, and also it's taking away 2 minutes of my 6 minutes. So as I was saying, I come from, I would say I have been privileged throughout the 3 weeks of non-stop violence that we have faced. I was literally sitting in my comfy office room on the 15th of July when I heard that my students, they were on the streets, and this was the first time that not necessarily the student wing of the ruling party, Bangladesh Chhatra League, was using violence to stop the people on the streets, but this time they were also using weapons, lethal weapons, starting from, I would say, the 15th of July. The university I used to teach at, it's located in Old Dhaka, and so that place, I would say it's local businessmen, and the students' league there, or the Jubo League, the youth wing of league, I would say they were more heavily armed. So they came down to the streets as early as July 15th, and the next day, as we know, the first murder of the July Revolution happened. Over time, what we have experienced in July was nothing but violence, nothing but escalating scales of state-sponsored oppression. We did not have internet for 10 days, so that is an experience. And in contrast to that, there are lessons learned. youth in Bangladesh, the students, professionals, during this time of blackout, people have found out ways to ensure communication. People would turn on their Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and think about other, using hypertext to get information through. And also we created hubs of like literally physical methods of transforming information. We would meet in a spot and we would like convey messages, like maybe in the old times we just didn't have doves to carry our letters. It was just us. And then as the days progressed, when more people were out in the streets, the biggest lessons learned, I would say, it was like before 5th of August and also a couple of weeks after the 5th of August, when, well, we were, by definition, we were governmentless in a way, and there were like a state of anarchy in places like people who have become unemployed in a sense, people who used to be political cadres, like, and creating this violence all over the street, all over the city. These people, without their leaders who have fled, these people turn to violence, or these people turn to extortion in the streets. And also we've heard of the robbery incidents right after the 5th August. So I'm referring to these situations, and also before 5th of August, there were like women on the streets, women of different attires, and then I would also see people even finding out a place on the streets to pray. And none of them had an issue with that. Oh, I see a woman standing there wearing whatever she wants, and also I'm praying, and they're all comrades in the same resistance. These are the lessons that these are the experiences from July, and these are the things that we can take a note of. And then furthermore, after the 5th of August, when there were violence on religious minority communities, we would see people from the majority communities coming up and standing beside them. So this is one of the major lessons that we should be taking note of. And if I want to talk about aspirations and some other, I would say this is a disappointment. The situation of martyrs and the situation of the treatment of the injured, I just want to say one sentence about this. We have completely failed them. We have tried. These people who have been on the street, lost their limbs, lost their eyes, lost their children. We can never do anything to compensate or like ever bring peace to them unless we are talking about solid reforms that do not bring about any kind of dictatorship and state oppression. Even if someone with the brand of democracy comes up and gives it to us and still delivers a form of state oppression, a form of oppression on women, of religious fascism, maybe that's also another concern in Bangladesh. So these are the reforms that we could think about, that in the times to come, people will always have to rise against tyranny. People will have to reunite, reorganize all the time, but the loss of lives and they are also resources for us. They are family people. They are here to build our country and even contribute to humanity as well. So these are the things, these losses. I don't think we need to go through any more losses. So I was just providing my humble opinions, like just a general public, just a layman participating in the demonstrations that were right on the street. So I guess I would, for now, end here.
Thank you, Arnie. Thank you, Arnie. So we're gonna, Islam would have been here, and I'd like to just very quickly point out what he said, because he's also another member of Gen Z who took part in July, and he would have gone after Arnie, and he does talk about reforms. So in terms of when he's thinking about the work that's needed, what he said is that the Prime Minister holds unilateral power to appoint heads of constitutional watchdog bodies, because he's looking at core constitutional reform, So I'd just like to highlight some of his bullet points. He wants us to think about these core constitutional flaws. And then in terms of the unicameral legislature elected under the first, past, and post, or what is called the FPTP, results in disproportionate legislative dominance. For example, parties have secured 67% of parliamentary seats with just 40% of the vote, enabling partisan constitutional amendments. These design flaws violate two fundamental principles of stable democracies, quote, fair rules of the game, end quote, and, quote, neutral referees, end quote. The ruling party can dominate oversight institutions and often amend the constitution to consolidate power. That is exactly what the former dictator Sheikh Hasina did repeatedly, where the constitution was no longer what it had started as. The next issue is about what are the current proposed reforms by the Consensus Commission. It is to establish a bipartisan appointed committee for constitutional bodies, ensuring more impartial oversight and reducing politicization, which is exactly what Aranya was mentioning in terms of how do we prevent a return of tyranny, return of that kind of autocratic dictatorship. We can introduce a bicameral parliament with an upper house elected by proportional representation. Requiring 2/3 majority in the upper house for constitutional amendments would make unilateral changes virtually impossible, especially since no party or coalition has ever won 67% of the popular vote in Bangladesh. But what is the current deadlock? So Islamul goes on to say, the party expected to win the next election is resisting these core reforms to attain unchecked executive authority. Again, this is his assessment. Anyone can, disagree. But the issue that he'd also like us to think about is like public awareness of these structural issues remains low. So this is also an issue around public literacy. It makes it difficult to build pressure necessary for these kinds of reforms. People want it, but then the hard work that's necessary is harder to get done. A dangerous misconception persists that these reforms are merely matters of electoral mandate. That's something parties can choose to implement if included in their manifesto and if they happen to win. But protecting the Constitution and its watchdog institutions from partisan manipulation is not optional. It is an essential part of democracy as is free and fair elections. If we allow executive unchecked power to control both, we don't have a democracy. We have constitutional authoritarianism. A functional democracy is impossible without broader consensus on these two foundational safeguards. So that is the most important thing that Islamul wanted to point out, and we're very, very sorry that very bad disruptive weather across the Northeast grounded his plane and he was not able to make it. A lot of our guests weren't able to make it for the same reason, but we're thankful to all of you who are here because the room is quite packed. So I'm going to pass it over to Catherine. And again, please keep writing your questions. And, you can mention who you are and if the question is to a particular panelist or if it's to the whole panel. So you can just write out, to whom or to the whole panel your question and then let us know who you are if you'd like to. But you can also keep it anonymous. But guess what? If we'd done the mic, you would not remain anonymous. So I'm going to ask you for your name. All right, over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today on behalf of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, which as an organization has worked on human rights in Bangladesh and with local civil society for over a decade. I'm going to focus my remarks on progress and challenges regarding accountability efforts for gross human rights violations that were perpetrated over the past 15 years, including potential steps that the U.S. and the broader international community may be able to take to reinforce these efforts. And first, for some context, for those who may be less familiar with the human rights situation over the past 15 years, it's well documented that Sheikh Hasina's government weaponized state institutions, including security forces and the judicial system, to silence political opponents, activists, and others expressing dissent. Such actions included extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, and arbitrary detention, including through the use of politically motivated criminal cases. To give you a sense of scale, local civil society, often at great personal risk, documented over 700 enforced disappearances and 2,500 extrajudicial killings perpetrated by security forces. One of the most notorious units is the Rapid Action Battalion, or RAB, a paramilitary unit of the police that includes members seconded from the military. And I think it's important to note for this audience initially received counterterrorism training from the United States. With police and judicial institutions instrumentalized for repression under Sheikh Hasina's government and civic space closed, there were very few options for domestic and international accountability. In this context, the US's targeted human rights sanctions regime became a tool through which the US could take a step to reinforce the voices calling for accountability. In 2021, following advocacy from members of civil society and members of Congress, the United States Treasury imposed global Magnitsky sanctions on RAB as a unit and 6 RAB officers, and the US State Department imposed visa restrictions on 2 RAB officers. US sanctions had a swift impact on Sheikh Hasina's government and the action of RAB security forces. In the period immediately following the sanctions, extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances dropped, and these sanctions ultimately saved lives. This background is also critical context for understanding the July Revolution, because it underscores the determination and the bravery of the thousands of students and citizen protesters who took to the streets, well aware of how the government had treated dissenting voices. As documented in the UN's 2025 fact-finding report, Sheikh Hasina and top leaders used security forces, including RAB, Detective Branch, and the Dhaka Metropolitan Police, to violently crack down on protesters with lethal force, committing hundreds of extrajudicial killings in what the UN said may amount to crimes against humanity. Following the regime change in August 2024, there is now the extremely difficult task of pursuing meaningful transitional justice in line with international standards, along with many institutional and legal reforms to the Constitution, the judiciary, and the security sector, all within time prior to the elections in 2026. And time is short to achieve institutional change that can withstand potential backsliding by future governments. The interim government has taken some important steps towards accountability for gross human rights violations. One of these steps is establishing the Commission of Inquiry on Enforced Disappearances. The Commission has now received over 1,800 complaints of enforced disappearances and uncovered at least 16 clandestine detention sites where victims were held by RAB, as well as DGFI, the Directorate General of Forces Intelligence. The government's also taken steps to reform the International Crimes Tribunal and is moving forward with investigations and trials, though further measures are needed to ensure adherence to international standards, support capacity, and protect victims and witnesses. It's hard to overstate the current challenges facing accountability efforts. There are sharp divisions within and among political institutions, and powerful forces don't want to see accountability efforts succeed. As noted by members of the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearances following a recent visit to Bangladesh, victims are deeply fearful to report cases because alleged perpetrators of enforced disappearances remain employed by security forces. Other alleged perpetrators have fled abroad to escape accountability, including some members of armed forces facing arrest warrants. The working group also reported concerns about the Army not cooperating with investigations. Last fall, the members of the Commission on Enforced Disappearances conducted inspections of clandestine detention sites and where victims were disappeared by RAB and DGFI, and found recent attempts to conceal and destroy evidence of abuses, including knocking down cell walls and painting over evidence or victims etched on walls. In light of these numerous challenges, I want to turn briefly to a few ways in which the US, the UN, and the broader international community may be able to support accountability and reform efforts. First, it's crucial that the US maintain sanctions on RAB. RAB's track record of impunity demonstrates it's beyond reform, and members of the military should be fully removed from civilian law enforcement. For the same reasons, the interim government should follow the recommendations of the UN and Bangladesh's Commission on Forced Disappearances and fully disband RAB. US and other jurisdictions with Magnitsky-style sanctions can consider expanding targeted sanctions to perpetrators from other security force units identified by the Commission and the UN's fact-finding report. There may also be opportunities to pursue prosecutions based on universal jurisdiction against those who have fled abroad. In addition, as Bangladesh is a top contributor to UN peacekeeping missions, the UN should suspend individuals from units facing credible allegations of abuses, pending the establishment of a rigorous vetting system to prevent their participation. As a final note, international monitors can also play a role in helping to address the challenges of disinformation about the human rights situation by providing independent reporting and assessments. A good example of this is that the interim government invited the UN fact-finding mission to conduct an independent investigation of what happened. The interim government also recently announced the coming establishment of a UN Human Rights Office in Dhaka, which will expand opportunities for UN monitoring and technical. International mechanisms can shine a light in the face of potential future backsliding. So of course, it's ultimately the collective responsibility of Bangladeshi citizens to way forward for rights respecting future. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share points about human rights and accountability, and I look forward to discussing these further in the Q&A. Thank you.
Next, we have Dina Siddiqui to round us off, and then we'll open it up for some discussion.
Tell me when my 5 minutes are over.
Yeah, I will give you a 2-minute reminder like this.
Oh, okay. If I look up, yeah, maybe you can send it. Yeah, thank you. I won't spend any more time. I wanted to thank Farhana and John and everybody else for making this possible and making actually a meaningful conversation possible. So I'm very happy to be here. I want to set, I'm going to be a little bit more informal. I want to set the stage for my comments by reminding us of the absolutely pivotal role that young women, but young women in particular, like you, played in the July uprising. It was cross classes, ethnicities, not necessarily everybody was an activist. And I think most of the audience here will be familiar, but it's worth really saluting, celebrating, and reminding us of how fearless these young people were, and young women, particularly on the streets. And the one image that I have never really forgotten is the image of a young girl who's trying to hold back a police van that has her brother and other people in it. That's what we call courage, right? It's very clear that women have shown, that young girls and women of all generations have shown they're perfectly capable of confronting an authoritarian state and demanding rights as citizens in a democracy. They don't need to be taught. They don't need training. That's not what young people in Bangladesh need. The young women, in particular, they stepped in when their male peers went missing. They modeled for us how to speak truth to power and I was there throughout the whole time, on the streets sometimes, not like you, but, watching them speak on TV, their analysis was razor sharp. They were showing us a different face of empowerment, not empowerment as in microcredit, but I think the fruits of many years of state and NGO attention, perhaps, but also the inheritance of Bengal, where in the history of women in anti-colonial movements and movements for social change, starting with Rokeya Sakhawat Singh of Sultana's Dream fame, I do think that's important to put in there. We are a year into this, and I was overjoyed and thrilled on August 5th. We were all out on the roads. But somebody mentioned disappointment. There's a really interesting article, op-ed piece going around about a year of shattered hope. So the uprising, and I want to really address this in my few minutes first, the uprising clearly opened up a temporary space for, and it was marvelous to see, for men and women out on the streets, people so-called secular, so-called fundamentalists, everybody was there and nobody really cared whether you were in a hijab or in a pair of jeans and you're older or younger. That's a particular moment I think all revolutionary moments have. That's gone. And what I see now, and the women seem to have disappeared, at least from the official versions of the story of the uprising. I do see tremendous despair in some quarters because the expectations were so high. But I do want to push back against the idea that women have been very big losers in post-uprising Bangladesh. I don't think that's true. And that does not mean, I don't want to underplay the actual violence. A lot of women, the moral policing, lots of things are going on. The rapes there, has happened over time in the last 40 years. The moral policing and the violence is not new, but in a power vacuum, it's very much more intense. We are seeing a lot more of it, but it's not because, and I think we really do have to understand why the violence is occurring, why and when and where, in a very situated kind of way, because it's very easy. I think it's really hard to, just say it's all backlash, or to say nothing has ever changed, or to say everything is fine. The reality is so muddied and so complex, right? So, of course, there was a rupture. There was a rupture with Sheikh Hasina's regime. But there wasn't, but there can be a lot of repetition because we haven't really changed our structures of governance, our policing practices, a lot of things that both of you were talking about. As Shireen Haq, who is the head of the Women's Commission, Women's Reform Commission, which, by the way, the interim government didn't, first of all, even think of. Women's rights activists had to push for it. But as Shireen Haq said, we had the uprising, but what was still in place was the public assertion of male domination, among other things, among class inequalities, everything else. So male students became the face of the uprising, and women's bodies became sites of political struggle easily appropriated. And it seems like, and there's a real struggle over who speaks for women's rights, right? And here is where I think for policymakers or people, we've been talking about disinformation that's there, but there's something more going on. I'm sure you've all heard stories about Bangladeshi soccer players who were in football matches that were cancelled. Right? That goes around in the international circuit. That story travels. Of course, yes, and it is true, no match should be stopped. Right? But it turns out that of 66 matches, 2 were rescheduled, 1 was cancelled. That shouldn't have happened. But that story takes on a life of itself because of global Islamophobia, and it serves a whole lot of other interests. This is not to underplay the threat of any kind of religious parties are there in Bangladesh, because now we have a democratic space in which we have to talk through these things, right? It's going to be very, very uncomfortable. But the previous government was able to weaponize and capitalize on its image of being better for women, on being protectors of secularism, and that became a cover for our authoritarianism. And that is I would say the, international community, many parts of it were perfectly happy with that, right? So I think if you're a policymaker, if you're thinking about things, you have to really think about who is the legitimate sort of, who can speak for women, right? Who really, and what is just, people making noise to be heard, as Samina Nitra, another feminist in Bangladesh, was saying about these obscure Bangladeshi Islamist groups have suddenly become very important. I want to end, I know my time is almost over, but I want to end with just 2 things. One is that the women's report that Shirin Haq headed, the Women's Reform Commission, is really pushing for extra seats in Parliament. I think it's very important to have not a quota system for women, we can talk about that, but a direct elections for women in reserved seats. That makes a lot of difference. And my second thing, I do work on the garment sector, so the increased tariffs, if you want to think about Bangladesh and Bangladeshi women, Bangladesh is a global space. It's not just a national space. What happens to Bangladeshi women depends on what happens to the global economy as much as what happens inside. So the 15% tariff that we used to have is bad enough. But when you have a 35% tariff, we saw what happened during COVID. Something very similar is going to happen. And already I know Walmart and other places the Walmart suppliers are holding off on even accepting orders because they're afraid that the price is just too high. It will, it'll undermine the industry. So there's a lot that the U.S. can do directly in terms of lobbying. And I know those conversations, maybe we can talk about that later, but in these trade negotiations, the Trump administration is really also trying to put in all kinds of conditionalities to get rid of, those tariffs. So it's a very mixed bag, but I think there's a lot that can be done in the U.S. by U.S. citizens. Thank you.
I invite folks to write down any questions you'd like to submit to volunteers to just get the panel going while I sort through the questions. So each panelist will just take a 1 minute to comment on something. So a year into this transition, what are the most under-recognized, overlooked risks facing Bangladesh's fragile path toward democratic recovery and democratic? So there's accomplishments we don't pay attention to, don't see. I'm going to go down the table, and if folks just want to highlight, a point or two, if they can, and then we'll bring
Under-recognized and over.
Yes.
Sorry.
So the most under-recognized accomplishments and overlooked risks. Identify one of each.
Under-recognized would be at least getting all these diverse people together. I mean, they weren't sitting for 15 years and look what that got. That got like more than 1,000 people killed. It was like the opposition parties were not trying to sit in one table. And also under-recognized in terms of democratic reform, I would also because I would again like to emphasize I'm a voter, I'm not a policymaker, I'm a general public. In that sense, I would say the community level resistance that was observed during July and after August, when people were trying to, in their communities, fight off bouts of anarchy or how they were being exploited by local extortionists. So these community level actions are also some under-recognized achievements that would play a role in the democratic recovery of Bangladesh, because these are the voters, these are the people who will make the decision. The political parties need to know that their speeches, their empty promises so far, just visiting people just before the election will probably, hopefully, not cut it out for them in the elections.
One under-recognized.
I think from the perspective of an international human rights organization, one under-recognized accomplishment is acceding to international human rights treaties. So when the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances was one of the first actions of the interim government. And then just last week, the interim government announced its intention to accede to the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. And these are very important international mechanisms for monitoring and accountability going forward. And that's why I wanted to highlight them. For example, The optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture establishes mechanisms for regular visits to detention sites by independent experts as a means to combat and deter torture. In terms of risks, I want to elaborate perhaps a little bit more on the International Crimes Tribunal. It's difficult to cover some of the challenges in 1 minute, but I want to note in particular the overlooked risks for those who have absconded abroad and face credible allegations of international crimes not being extradited to stand trial. There's been, of course, much discussion about the extradition of Sheikh Hasina, not occurring from India for political reasons, but I think the overlooked piece of the conversation is how the death penalty plays a legal barrier to extradition. So as a human rights organization, we would advocate against the death penalty in compliance with international fair trial standards. But I think, again, the overlooked piece is that, for example, for many European countries, the death penalty would provide a major barrier to preventing extradition for those who have absconded, and it also prevents these countries from providing support to the ICT, as well as the UN providing support for capacity challenges. So I'd highlight that as an overlook.
Okay, one point.
Pick from all of your basket of goodies.
Right. I think we've, okay, in that case, I think what of the the Women's Reform Commission has managed to put in some really wonderful recommendations and suggestions. And as far as I can tell, it's like a basket of dreams. So we have them all written down. From, marital rape, banning marital rape, to acknowledging sex workers, to whatever else, working women's rights, it's all there in a form. It's, 500, 300 extra women in parliament. These are all, many of them are not doable, but they're aspirations for women, right? And I think it's really good. I don't think we appreciate how much work goes into those things, right? I think that's important. The risk, from my perspective, one risk I see is there's so much critique, and critique is good, or there's so much celebration, which is also fine, that I'm afraid we might be at risk of forgetting why this movement started, which at the heart was about youth unemployment, about not having a future. So I think having real discussions about what development means, what it means, we can have endless discussions on FDI. That's not why these young men and women were on the streets. And I think we have to not forget that.
Thank you so much. So each of our panelists raised really important points. Some of them were actually answering some of the questions. So having looked through these questions, we have some great questions. So there's some overlap in the questions. Maybe I'll cluster them. So there's a couple for both Dina and Oroni in terms of the role of young women, and I'll read out both, and both Dina and Oroni. So one says, women were key to the July Revolution. This is Dina, as you stated, but how can Bangladesh affect fundamental change so women's rights are fully respected in the new Bangladesh? And this is from and if for Oroni is something similar, it is, what made the student leaders decide not to take a leadership role for themselves after Hasina fled and instead turned to leadership. And linked to the first question to Dina is from Rima. Is how can women gain back, especially young women gain back, the uprising spirits that cause change? So there's a little bit of overlap between what these comments. So maybe you can combine them, like how do you get back that spirit? And also what does it mean to have effective fundamental change to women's rights? For me, why do you think goals? And then there's a question, I'm not sure who it's from, but it says, what are your thoughts on free and fair election in Bangladesh, and what are the current violations of rule of law for Catherine? So again, your thoughts on free and fair elections in Bangladesh, violations of law, and the other one you already answered, Catherine. Files, and there's another one. In terms of, but I'll hand it to you while Lina and Bernie respond. This is you. Bernie, do you want to?
I obviously don't speak for the student leaders, even though we have been distant comrades in our times in that university. I would say this actually reflects a part of humility in this part, that they did not grasp power when it was given to them. In fact, one of the advisors, Nahid Islam, he also stepped down from and then he decided he would go from door to door to build politics from scratch. So I think that reflects how these people who have not thought a second about their own lives and got to the streets for freedom of speech, these people are not necessarily power hungry, violent power grabbers who just wanted to be the chief advisor. Also, relying on someone who is a Nobel laureate and who wants to work with the grassroots people of Bangladesh and change their lives, change the typical image of poverty that we know of Bangladesh. This person felt like someone to trust, someone who all the parties would listen to, especially how we've seen how the political landscape is of not listening to anyone. So maybe these are the hopes and aspirations based on which they choose.
Okay, I'll just, I'm not sure. That's a very difficult question.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. So I don't know, how do women affect fundamental change things? Democracy is in process, so this kind of becoming, this is all a processual thing. I would say that it's very clear that Bangladeshi women of different generations are very conscious of what they're up against. So there's a real momentum that the uprising has unleashed, it seems to me. So when there was something, when Hifazat-e-Islam was doing whatever it was doing, you had women's groups, all kinds of different women's groups come together to produce this Moitri Jatra, right? It was a big deal, I think, right? It made a difference in the national imagination, I think. Those are the kinds of things. But of course, women aren't a uniform category. So women in the Chittagong Hill Tracts need demilitarization. Let's face it, right? So, and then garment workers need a different kind of, the right to organize. So there are I don't think we can have a simple answer to that. What I would say to, how can we bring the spirit back is, again, I don't think we can bring the spirit back. I think what we can do is move with the openings that have been created. So Umama Fatima, who was a student leader, Tatra union leader, right? Who was very vocal at the beginning, has actually just resigned from the student party because she said she found it not political, not feminist enough. So that's actually, I think all of that is good. This is what we need to do. We're not going to have a magic solution where this party will give you all your rights. We're going to have to talk things through to get to a point where people agree on certain things. And the final thing I will say is that I think we've managed to get away from this very homogenizing religion, secularism binary right? And we're just beyond just thinking about religion bad, secularism good, and thinking about what does it even mean? And whose interests are being served, right? By just constantly thinking about women's issues through religion or through something else. Women's issues are very, very complicated and intersectional.
And following up on a few questions related to free and fair elections, the rule of law, and then another question about balancing fundamental rights with national security. Those are very broad questions, but to make a few points, it's very important that election reform can happen before the elections, and I think it's important for that process for civil society and citizens to be as involved as possible. So I think there needs to be more opportunity for engagement with civil society and the general population on the reforms that are taking place. And I think as well, it's really important for there to be an enabling civic space for engagement, so protections for freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. And this is something that there's been very significant improvements, but it's still fraught with challenges. And so, as an example, the interim government has undertaken reviewing politically motivated cases under problematic laws, such as the Cybersecurity Act. But it's very important that for all cases where there isn't credible evidence, regardless of political affiliation, that those cases are reviewed. And so those who are being detained and charged are only where there's concrete evidence that crimes have been committed. This includes for journalists, and so it's important moving forward that there's additional protections for civic space and freedom of expression. And this also includes more engagement on reforms to problematic laws like the Cybersecurity Act. So the interim government worked on a cyber protection ordinance to reform it. But that was an area where there could have been more engagement from civil society and additional steps to remove some of the problematic provisions like criminal defamation that had previously been used. And I think, as a final point, it's also very important, for international partners who want to support these efforts to make sure that they're engaging and being led by the interests of local civil society and human rights organizations to guide in how international partners can be supported.
Back to one of the other for follow-up. And that's one of mine because I have many to ask. But I want to turn it to the role of the diaspora and the international community. Before we conclude in the next 10 minutes, if you still have questions, please go ahead and get the notepad. Please feel free to ask the question in Bangla or English. So one of the questions going back to the role of the diaspora was how can the international partners, those in the room, those in the city, throughout the U.S. and elsewhere, as well as the Bangladeshi diaspora that care about rebuilding democracy, rather than the diaspora that benefited from that cronyism, fascism, and embezzled $272 million. The last $272 million that we know of, in U.S. dollars, mind you, from Bangladesh. That's a lot of money. Those are not the people we're talking about. We're talking about the people who actually want to see something good happen to Bangladesh, right? In terms of actual progress and actual human flourishing, and all the things that are civic space, human rights, women's rights, education, employment, opportunity. What are the ways that we can help support that? One of the ways, one of the other questions was how can we extradite? People who are living in the U.S., I won't talk about other countries, but in the U.S. and elsewhere, that in various cities, in this city, in suburbs of the city, are there processes? Could there be some sort of way that the diaspora, the international community can help? Or, that is one example. But there are many, many ways that we can do this. How else do we support, let's say, reforms without undermining people who are working on this inside Bangladesh, or reinforcing any form of independence. And now we know the USA is gone, so a lot of development projects have fallen apart, funding has fallen apart, that's livelihoods, agriculture, water treatment, malaria treatment, TB, all of those things, right? Things that funded those projects are their way. So, we can go down the development track, we can go down the tradition track, we can go the law track. So that's one of the other issues. I'll let you guys just give a quick one, not more than 1 minute, because I am going to do a hard stop at 11:10. Touch on any one of them.
I would like to suggest, especially for the Bangladeshi Diaspora Committee, is the National Citizens Party, the one that has been growing under the leadership of the students who have participated in the protest. We have also kept talking about voting by the diaspora community, mailing of ballots to the respective embassies, and so that the people who are still citizens of Bangladesh can get to vote, and also the people who are actually the backbone of the economy can get to make the political decisions they want to make. So also because there are a lot of people who study policies and also future policymakers or past policymakers here. That's why I bring this up, and maybe I could be enlightened on the topic of how could this go on. The diaspora community voting.
Thank you. Yes, I've highlighted a number of ways that international partners can engage on this, such as targeted sanctions regimes, universal jurisdiction prosecutions. Thinking here particularly where, as I mentioned, there'll be challenges in European countries for extraditions related to the death penalty, international monitoring, suspension from UN peacekeeping, and then also, again, underscoring the importance for all of these efforts to make sure they're very much in collaboration with and locally led civil society and human rights groups. And I think, for those of us in the U.S., it's really important to continue to engage here with members of Congress and voting. I think it's hard to overstate the devastating impact of the AIDS cut on Bangladesh across the country, including in the Rohingya refugee camps, where there's over 1 million refugees who fled from Myanmar who are facing starvation, no health care, cuts to education. And so there's opportunities for those of us in the U.S. to engage on this.
Thanks. I just following up on that. It seems to me, as somebody who works on the garment industry, what people, the diaspora included, what people could do in this country is really lobby Congress regarding U.S. policy, especially trade policy, toward Bangladesh, as the Congressman Doggett said, the U.S. And it affects people. If you really care about women in Bangladesh, then that's something you can really try and do effectively. I mean, the tariffs are just one thing, but I think there's something more to be done. I want to use 30 seconds to say one thing I should have said earlier about how to get back that spirit that you were talking about. And it's not just about young people, but the interim government has really failed in one respect, which is to really protect, like when people like Shirin Haq, who were the head of the Women's Reform Commission, were attacked as, stigmatized in all kinds of ridiculous ways. There was total silence from the government, but also from civil society. It was like a patriarchal kind of silence, but the IG didn't say anything. That is the time people need protection of a certain moral support, right? That could have been extended, nothing more. But certainly.
Thank you, in the interest of time, we'll be wrapping up in minutes. I see another yellow piece of paper coming up very quickly. Thankfully, the last two were already addressed. Maybe this has been addressed. How do we effectively establish better U.S.-Bangladesh so that Bangladeshi women are heard. I think that's been sort of addressed by what Gina said and Orly said, and what also, all of these are social, economic, geopolitical, human rights issues. There's no such thing as the women's issue. They're cut across, right? So when we think about it, during that brutal murder that happened in Mitchford, right? Where was the Jonathan? Where is the public? And imagine what happened when the girl was smoking. And the outrage. Again, that's patriarchy, but it's an issue of law and order, but it's also an issue of societal norms, right? So if we want to support these things, we must bring about a change in mindsets. And I think we saw that. A year ago, we saw a massive shift in mindset. It's not impossible. So I think that's the way we get back to the spirit. That spirit of the revolution, the spirit of the uprising, to bring about change for the good and not just for the good. And I think what I want to do is basically just sort of conclude and wrap up our panel. So our panel's goal was to do that overview and, account for the July Revolution. And then think about the ways we can move forward. And it will segue nicely into the next panel. But I invite you all to engage with our speakers today or, afterwards. And after today, you can always email them. But I would like to ask you to please give a special round of applause for Orani after
Thank you.
Thank you, Farhana, and thank you to the wonderful. This is an outstanding discussion, and hopefully it's provoked some. Not only should you engage with the panelists, but I hope after today, as you reflect on things, you'll engage with each of our organizations to think about how we can work collectively. So as we excuse Farhana and her panelists, we'll ask Shamrut Muhyiddin and her panelists to move up front. We're not going to take a break, as I mentioned before, if you need to step out for a comfort break. But otherwise, I'll hand it over to Shamrut. And after Shamrut, as Farhana mentioned, we'll have a brief wrap up and then we'll serve some light refreshments for those people.
That was good. Yeah.
Was that you, Sharon? Good response. Are you okay?
That's Elena sitting there, so if you want to sit.
Yeah, hi. Good. Just here. Really appreciate I can guess like better.
Yeah, I think we're good. I think this one's
Good to go?
Yes.
Just started. Otherwise, people will
Okay, everyone, can we ask everyone to have a seat? We're about to start the next panel, please.
It's an amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Especially once you engage.
Thank you. A little bit. Hi. Hi. How are you? So, you know Bangladesh television.
Yeah, no, it's nice to get up.
Yeah.
We're so
Say hi.
Sorry. Couple of minutes.
Yeah. It's good to see you. Yeah. How are you? Like the same type of seminar, right?
I saw that Murtaza was here too.
Yeah.
Murtaza from your press team was here too, right?
Very good.
I saw him in the back.
I was
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I saw him. So
we have Prabhash and Atal, and also
we actually came from New York.
so for us. Possibly in the middle of your session, I may have to leave. I haven't
that's
anything,
okay.
but yeah.
I'm the
Wow. Yeah, it's been a while. Yesterday, Shamika was telling that you had a brief exchange with
Excuse me, if we could all take our seats, please, so we can get started. I will get in real trouble if Ambassador Mosina has to wait much longer.
I'll take it afterwards. Okay.
Where's the motion?
So if everyone could please take their seats.
We could shift down just a little bit. Yeah, if we could shift down. Could I ask everyone to shift down just a little?
I was very pleased to see you. So here we are. Yes. Everybody. The best ask to move our chairs.
I should ask everyone to have a seat. We're about to start the next panel.
Are you okay? You're hanging on the end there.
In the back, if you could have some outside to just help folks sit down. Great. We'll kick off the next session, which is focused on Bangladesh and the world, as you saw on the agenda. So we're going to be looking at Bangladesh's relationship with various regional partners as well as other global partners, and all the changing dynamics in terms of politics and economics that we've been seeing over the last year, and about how Bangladesh is shifting geopolitically as well to adjust to those trends. We have a solo panel to discuss these issues. I'll be introducing them here in a second. I know that trade issues are top of mind for many folks, but we hope to not limit the discussion to those issues, but just broadly around how Bangladesh can engage with all those different partners. So to my right, I have Michael Kugelman, who is a South Asia columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and also senior fellow at Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And he's a thought leader on U.S. policy in South Asia, and until recently was founding director of the Wilson Center South Asia Institute. He writes often on South Asia issues for Foreign Policy magazine, including for a weekly brief. His recent projects have focused on U.S.-India technology cooperation, the future of U.S.-Pakistan relations, and U.S.-Afghanistan relations. He speaks frequently to media outlets, as well as has written for a number of newspapers and so on, including the LA Times, New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Politico, and others. And Michael has really been a thought leader on Bangladesh's transition to democracy as well. So we hope to kind of hear about foreign relations in the context of that. To Michael's right, we have Ambassador Mosina, who is, as many of you know him, is served in Bangladesh from 2011 to 2014, and is one of the biggest champions of Bangladesh. I think he's the only ambassador who might have gone to every district in Bangladesh, really going out of his way to visit across the country. And he's had a 38-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service. And his other foreign assignments included were in Zambia, DRC, India, Pakistan, of course, in Bangladesh before as well as political and economic counselor. He also, during his career, facilitated South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy, and he's been a professor of national security affairs at the National Law College in DC, and has mentored junior foreign service officers. And Ambassador Mozina is originally from Iowa, a state that he loves. And then to his right is Ehtisham Haq. And Ehtisham Haq is with one of the sponsoring organizations here. He's with BRAIN, which is one of the groups putting today's event together, and he's the lead of operations for BRAIN, and also adjunct professor at American University. He's an experienced corporate lawyer with over a decade of experience serving as an in-house counsel as well as outside general counsel for major corporations across the tech sector. And he serves as principal attorney at his own law offices, and also has served in legal roles at different Fortune 500 companies. And also an interesting detail about Ehtisam's background is that he's also been involved with the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, doing some of their communications work during 2022-2023. So I might actually come to you for questions about the BNP, given your experience with them. And then last but not least, we have Moshmi Khan, the senior advisor at the Asia Group, just landing yesterday from Bangladesh to DC, so thanks for cutting through the jet lag and being here. And she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Most recently, she was the U.S. Alternative Executive Director on the Board of Directors of the Asian Development Bank in Manila. Prior to that, she lived and worked in Bangladesh for about 10 years, where her last role was as CEO of Nirapon, which is a successor organization to the North American Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety. She currently advises companies and organizations on strategy, governance, and impact in emerging markets. So really excited to be here with all of you. My name is Shamaruk Muhyiddin. I'm with the Catalyst Group, which is a global consulting firm here in DC, advising the U.S. government and private sector. And I spent a lot of my career working on U.S.-Bangladesh relations, so know a number of you in the room from that experience as well. And currently running the Bangladesh Project, which is a DC-based advisory group for policymakers. So I'll first start off with quite broad questions to each of you. So if I could ask each of you to give remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes about specific topics, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. And if you have questions during the remarks from the panelists, please do write them down, because we're going to come to Q&A quite quickly. So if you could just start writing down your questions, then we'll have a volunteer go around and start collecting those. So I'll first turn to Ambassador Mozina, given your role in the past serving as U.S. ambassador to Bangladesh, and since then also following Bangladesh issues so closely, what is, in your opinion, sort of kind of what the interim government should do in terms of approaching U.S.-Bangladesh relations, as well as for future elected government in Bangladesh, and also for the U.S., what should the U.S. prioritize in terms of its relationship? Of course, we won't have everything we're looking for, but in your view, what should be the U.S. priorities in Bangladesh? And feel free to take a broader look at these issues as well.
Thanks a lot, Shamaruk, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. Special thanks to my former partner, John Danlovich. He and I were 2 years together in Dhaka. Thank you and all the organizers for making this event happen. And Farhana, great thanks to you and your panel. Wow, you set a real foundation for this discussion. So, Shamaruk just put out there the question for me. It's a very narrow question. I'm going to try real hard to stay in that lane. That's not easy for me. It's a tough question because everything is so fluid right now. Look at Dhaka. Look at Washington. There's a lot of moving pieces here. So there's no clear, easy answer to Shamaruk's very good question. So I thought what I would try to do is just take a look at some of the recent developments, try to look at the context so we can understand better the U.S.-Bangladesh evolving bilateral relationship. Big, surprising things are happening in both countries. We just heard in some detail about the July Revolution in Bangladesh. But as I'll come to in a few minutes, big things are happening in Washington as well. So first, looking at Bangladesh. Bangladesh has had revolutions before. We know that. None of them has institutionalized democracy. They've given us, what have they given us? One-party rule, military dictatorship, 15-year autocrat. But the leaders of the July Revolution, maybe they've broken that mold. Maybe. They didn't have a big fight over who's going to sit in the big chair. Can you imagine this? This is not how things are supposed to happen. But they didn't. Instead, they turned to Professor Muhammad Yunus. And he was the perfect choice. Yeah. I think, the perfect choice to lead that nation to sustainable democracy and development. What a great surprise those student leaders were for me. And it gives me hope that this revolution, unlike all those other ones, this one will be different. And I'm inspired by Yunus's leadership and his determination to lay the groundwork, the foundation for democracy and continued development in Bangladesh. I know all about the challenges and the obstacles. We heard about them in the last panel, but my money's with Yunus and the people of Bangladesh. I think they're going to pull this off. But Bangladesh is not alone in having big surprises. I don't know about you, but I never saw coming at me what has happened in America in the last 6 months. I didn't see that coming. I didn't anticipate that America first actually virtually means America alone on the international stage. We're going it alone as we advance our interests. I did not anticipate the dismantling of USAID and those other elements of our toolkit to promote soft power. I didn't see any of that coming as America now shifts to other forms of power. I didn't anticipate the fundamental changes of America's tactics and goals and strategy on the international arena. I didn't see that coming. So, big surprises in Dhaka, big surprises in Washington. And this is all still playing out. It's very fluid. But some things are not changing. Bangladesh and America each matters to each other's peace, security, and prosperity. Bangladesh needs America, for example. And we heard about America, the largest market, the number one or number two source of remittances, huge investor, innovative investor in Bangladesh, and of course helping to support 1 million Rohingya refugees and other things, but time's running out. America needs Bangladesh. Sometimes we forget Bangladesh is the 8th largest country in the world. Sometimes we forget. Bangladesh is a moderate Muslim majority nation whose economy whose economic growth and now its emerging democracy hold potential to offer the developing world, especially the Islamic developing world, a model, an alternative to violent extremism and despotism. So the challenge is how the U.S. and Bangladesh find each other in these much changing circumstances so each can advance its self-interest. So let's just take a quick look at that. I am so encouraged by Bangladesh's engagement with America on trade and tariffs. Those are the priorities of this administration. You can like them, you can not like them, it doesn't matter. That's where Washington is. And I think Eunice and his team, I think they swallowed very hard. But they're at the table, and they're trying to engage with America. It is not easy. The interim government must sustain this engagement. It must find a way to move forward. As we heard earlier, 35% tariffs would really kill Bangladesh. And the interim government must sustain its efforts to increase Bangladeshi imports of American goods, aircraft, energy, cotton, just a long list of things. Because this is what matters to Washington. And Bangladesh must find a way to connect. I think America's RMG importers must also help the current administration understand how important Bangladesh is to America. You go to Walmart, you're buying Bangladeshi clothes. And that's where America is shopping. We need Bangladesh as a partner. And I believe Bangladesh, the government of Bangladesh, I hope the Sharjah is around, needs to clarify to the administration the role it can play in advancing stability in the Indo-Pacific region. America says that's a geostrategic interest of our country. Bangladesh is critical to advancing that. And the diaspora, we've had good discussion about the diaspora. They can play a role in this. They need to reach out to the congressional people here. We had two wonderful representatives here earlier today, and we have staff members still here. Need to reach out to them to promote a deeper understanding of Bangladesh's role in advancing U.S. interests. That's an important part of that. Bangladesh, of course, has many friends here on Capitol Hill. We just met two of them a minute ago. And Bangladesh needs to engage these friends, urge them to bring greater understanding that a close, productive, bilateral partnership benefits both countries. I'm underscoring that point by virtually repeating it. And I hope, too, that Bangladesh's friends on the Hill will urge an early appointment of a new U.S. ambassador to Bangladesh. That position has been vacant for a year. Now, we have a really good Sharjah out there, but she needs an ambassador. The two can partner together and promote our interests. And I hope Bangladesh will help out our Sharjah here, who is working so hard, so he can have a new ambassador here too. So, turbulent times in our bilateral relationship. I don't have any neat, tricky response to Shamaruk's question. It's uncharted waters. I don't know how this bilateral relationship is going to play out. 35% tariffs takes my breath away. The only certainty I have is that the stakes of this bilateral relationship are high for both countries. Bangladesh and America need each other. And it's the best interest of both countries to forge strong bilateral ties. And our challenge, each of us sitting in this room right now, our challenge is to play our respective parts to help America, to help Bangladesh find a way to forge that mutually beneficial bilateral partnership.
Thank you, Ambassador Mozina. I'll come back to you to follow up on some of the remarks that you've just made, but I think you've made the case very strongly for having very constructive and strong bilateral relations between the two countries. I'll shift gears a little bit to focus on some of the other partners that Bangladesh has around the world. Michael, you've studied Bangladesh's relationships with the region, with India, Pakistan, and others, as well as with other players like China. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about as Bangladesh is thinking about realigning with these different countries and focusing on a more equity-based foreign policy, because I think one of the things that came up during the uprising is that some of the diplomatic arrangements were a bit one-sided. So I think that there is a focus on making some of the kind of bilateral relationships a bit more advantageous for Bangladesh for many reasons. So I would love to hear your thoughts about where you see these relationships going and what kind of implications that has on U.S. policy as well as the U.S. is considering its policy in the region.
Well, thank you, Shamrukh. And I should say I'm really happy, really honored to be part of this event. And I express my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me. There are not enough discussions or events on Bangladesh in this town. As you say, the world's 8th most populous country. Many folks in this town would not necessarily realize that. You all do, but many do not. Not even after the tumultuous and highly consequential events of the last year. Not enough discussion on Bangladesh. So I really appreciate the hosts for hosting this, and I'm grateful to be here. So to your great question, we heard in the previous panel about all the massive changes in Bangladesh's politics since last summer, but I would argue that on the external front, regarding Bangladesh's foreign policy, the changes have actually not been quite as great to this point. So let me explain. Hasina's departure did pave the way for big changes on Dhaka's foreign policy front. That's very clear. The main one involves India. Hasina had special relations with, or I should say, special relationship with Modi and Modi's India and the BJP, but also, let's not forget, with the Indian opposition. I mean, if you look at Hasina's family, her father had close ties with the Congress, with the Gandhi family in India. So, indeed, post-Hasina, Bangladesh's relationship with India has become more tense. That's very clear. This has created openings for Dhaka to pursue warmer ties with China. Hasina did strengthen ties with China. Let's not forget that. From Chinese infrastructure investment, like BRI, to arms sales. But there were some unstated red lines that Dhaka had to be careful not to cross, particularly anything that could undercut India's security interests. Post-Hasina, those red lines are not present, and New Delhi's influence over Dhaka is nowhere near as great. So Dhaka's scope for engagement with China is larger. Meanwhile, similarly, post-Hasina, Dhaka now has opportunities to explore resetting ties with Pakistan, which really did not advance much at all during the Hasina era. Over the last year, we've seen China and Bangladesh reaffirm their partnership in a big way, with China pledging lots of new investments, including a project to modernize the Bangla port, which of course is the second largest port in Bangladesh. Dhaka has showed its comfort level with pushing back against India, such as when Dr. Yunus, while in Beijing earlier this year, downplayed publicly in a speech, downplayed the geostrategic importance of the northeastern Indian states and dismissed them as landlocked states with no access to the ocean. It's hard to imagine Sheikh Hasina or anyone from her government saying such a thing. Meanwhile, we've seen some significant steps by Dhaka to kickstart trade with Pakistan. More broadly, there's been a series of high-level engagements, including some between the Bangladesh and Pakistan militaries, which has not pleased India. A Bangladesh warship participated in the Aman naval exercises hosted by Pakistan this year. It's the first time, I believe, in about 10 years that Bangladesh participated in those exercises in that way. But here's the thing, coming back to what I said at the start, despite this, I haven't really sensed any shifts, any major shifts, aside from the fact that relations with India have grown more tense. Dhaka has not cut off ties with New Delhi. There have been a series of high-level engagements between the two governments, including Dr. Yunus meeting Prime Minister Modi in Bangkok some months ago. I would argue that the nature and tenor of Bangladesh's cooperation with China has merely continued what we'd already been seeing in past years. And as for relations with Pakistan, so far it's been mostly more exploratory than operational. Scaling up bilateral trade between Bangladesh and Pakistan, it's going to require some creativity because both states, one would argue, are natural competitors, not partners, because they both have similar emphases on exports, garments, and of course, in the case of Bangladesh, RMGs. So a useful case study that I'll cite here is something that happened just a few weeks back. Senior diplomats from Bangladesh, China, and Pakistan met at a China-South Asia summit in China. So the Chinese and the Pakistani government readouts of the meeting depicted this gathering as a big new thing, the start of a new trilateral cooperation mechanism. Dhaka's readout, however, was more subdued. It didn't make any promises of future meetings. It seemed to distance itself from this three-way meeting on the whole. So what could have been at play here, or why this reaction? Just throw out a few considerations for context. One, there might be hesitation now within the interim government for an unelected administration to commit to a new arrangement that might be perceived as alliance-like, which would amount to a significant foreign policy shift for Bangladesh, given that Bangladesh has always had a non-aligned policy formally with no alliances. It's one thing to push closer to China and Pakistan, but it would be something completely different to engage in alliance-like behavior. I'd also note that some of the sharpest critics of India within the interim government in Bangladesh have been the student leaders, and many of them, and I should say these student leaders are folks that Dr. Yunus has tended to defer to. Many of these student leaders have left the government. Some of them have left the government in recent months to form their own party, then to form their new party and grow it out. And so that might suggest that there's now more space within the interim government for more moderate voices on India. If we widen the scope and look at Bangladesh's foreign policy beyond the region over the last year, there's generally been a fair amount of consistency with what we saw and seen in here as well. We've seen efforts to pursue ties with key trade partners in Europe and the U.S., with critical energy and commercial partners more broadly in the Middle East. Since its independence, Bangladesh's foreign policy has been governed by this mantra of friendship to all, malice toward none, coined by the independence leader, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, Sheikh Hasina's father. Now, for political reasons, you're not going to hear members of this interim government invoking that mantra. But generally speaking, I think that non-aligned approach to foreign policy has remained in place. All that said, in great part because of all the tumults in today's world order, Bangladesh is going to face significant foreign policy challenges in the coming weeks and months. So I'll close by just identifying three foreign policy challenges that the interim government, and especially the next government, the next elected government, will need to confront. One is the relationship with India, and that's very clear. There has been strong anti-India sentiment in Bangladesh, which is not new, but I think we've seen an increase in that over the last year or so. There will be political pressure on Dhaka to keep some distance from New Delhi. I'd argue that Dhaka cannot afford to lose India for reasons tied to key interests ranging from border security to economic needs, as well as connectivity. A quiet success story over the last year was the inauguration of an electricity sharing deal between Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. There's a strong chance that Bangladesh's next government will be led by the BNP. I'll let those that are more well-placed to speak on the BNP speak to that, but I suspect that a government in which the BNP has a significant role will want to explore resetting ties with with Delhi. And Delhi, again, this is just my sense, Delhi, knowing that the BNP has ended its alliance with Jamaat, will probably be keen to look into reciprocating. My understanding is that India's main concern when it comes to political parties in Bangladesh is Jamaat. Still, for Dhaka, managing these expectations in combination with the anti-India sentiment, each side's grievances about the other, from Hasina's presence in India, she's not going to be sent back to Bangladesh, let's make that very clear, to Indian disinformation campaigns, widening space for religious actors in Bangladesh, managing all that will be very difficult. Second foreign policy challenges is ensuring the security of Bangladesh's assets, interests, and equities in the Middle East amid the continuing volatility there that's unlikely to end anytime soon. Like many other South Asian states, Bangladesh relies on energy supplies in that region. More broadly, it relies on key trade routes, including the Strait of Hormuz, to import goods, but also to send exports westward to key markets in Europe and the U.S. Bangladesh doesn't have the luxury that India does of being able to turn more to widely available domestic energy supplies. And on a related note, you all know this, Bangladesh has a large number of expatriates working in the Middle East that send back remittances that make a key contribution to what is now a shaky economy. So if you have instability, conflict picking up in the Middle East again, that prompts evacuations of these expatriates. Bangladesh's economy could be impacted because of the remittance factor. Third and final challenge for DACA, and I'll wrap up here, and this really gets no attention at all in Washington, despite its importance, the border with Myanmar. It's really messy and complex. The Arakan Army, which is a potent armed group, it controls most of the 160-mile border with Bangladesh. That's a lot of strategic real estate, along the northeastern reaches of the Bay of Bengal. Armed Rohingya groups in Bangladesh have pledged to fight the Arakan Army. They've sought to recruit Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. There's a really good international crisis report analysis of this very issue I advise you all to take a look at. This, even as DACA has sought to engage with the Arakan Army while carefully managing ties with the Homeland Myanmar. This is a major minefield that DACA will need to navigate. So I was going to say something about the challenge of relations with the U.S., but I think Ambassador Molinas did a great job of that. Happy to cover that in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Comprehensive answer. I know that others might have a number of questions on each of these points. So without wasting much time, I'll move on to Moshini Khan, and then I'll come to you at the end. So Moshini, you've spent a lot of your time at the Asian Development Bank and have had a long career on global economic issues as well. Love to hear your thoughts on Bangladesh's economic challenges and its positioning with global partners around key investment relationships, what we should be hoping for from the interim government and for future elected governments, especially in terms of creating employment and a stable economy with robust private sector growth. So what are the key conditions that are the underlying factors for all of that? Because we also know that in terms of the uprising, a key grievance that students had was around employment, right? It started with the job quota reform movement. So private sector growth and employment, these are really important questions and really key to stable democracies, right? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on how Bangladesh can position itself and what your observations on what's happening already.
Thank you. I'd like to first begin by thanking the organizers of this. I know how difficult it is to be a Matawari, I hope I said it right, to herd cats, so I really appreciate the convening of a diverse group of organizations. Also, the fellow panelists, as some of you are old friends, I've been able to hear a different perspective, and I think some of these issues that were raised earlier will also touch upon your question as well. And then lastly, I would really like to thank the audience and U.S. policymakers who happen to be here. We are sitting in the U.S. Capitol, and we've had some great speakers earlier. I can't underemphasize how important it is to have a really grassroots, really frontline perspective on what's happening because it does impact the geopolitics and the economic relations of the U.S. But before that, though, I'd like to give my deepest respect and admiration for the students and all those who were killed for this revolution, because it's, really, that's the reason we're here today. And then also migrant workers who actually are the basic of why Bangladesh's economic, remittances and the economy stand. So I really wanted to start by saying that because I think that's something that might be overlooked in terms of this larger discussion. And then the three actors that I wanted to discuss, I know we talked about it earlier, are the government of Bangladesh, including the interim government. Let's manage expectations and, really keep in mind that this is an interim government who came for a period of time for a very specific task. And then MDB's Multilateral Development Bank, as you mentioned, I did spend a few years at the ADB as a U.S. rep on the board, as well as the private sector. So looking at the government, looking at the role of MDB, and looking at the private sector. But before I do that, I wanted to give some context to my own thinking about the revolution and the economy and geopolitics because of the excellent first panel. As I was listening to the panel, it really struck me how this news traveled and what happened. And I remember last July where I was on a cruise, a family cruise to Alaska, and my at the time 14-year-old daughter said, "Oh my gosh, something's happening in Bangladesh." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "There's a protest outside the street of where we usually live in Bangladesh." And she heard about it from TikTok, and she heard it from some other folks there. So I want to mention this because we heard this in the middle of an ocean in I think close to Alaska by that time, but it's not something that was on my radar at all. Secondly, a family member on a family WhatsApp group said Abu Saeed had just died. I have to admit, I've never even heard of Abu Saeed. But apparently he was a genius scholar of the Center for Zakat Management, an organization that was run by one of our, something that our family is connected to somehow. So Abu Saeed was a young student, as you know, and he was killed. And so the family member just said, I know many of you have met him and this has happened. Again, it didn't register. And I get back to ADB and I'm having lunch, and by this time it's very clear what has happened. I'm having lunch with some senior management folks, and they said, you know, the internet, it almost caused, the lack of internet in Bangladesh almost caused Bangladesh to default on a very large loan. And I say that because all of these disparate kinds of things that happen in the middle of an ocean of finding out by young people have these geopolitical and very international ramifications. So that's the context in which I came to learn of this revolution. But then let me also bring you back to my stint and my time in Bangladesh, which as a Bangladeshi American growing up in Michigan, I really had not spent much time in Bangladesh except for these 10 years where I met a lot of old friends, including some sitting here. And I wanted to say that 2010, I remember May 8th, I think is when May 11th was my first day on the job, I believe. I was recruited by BRAC to be their first legal and director of legal and compliance. At the time, you may have known that the attacks against Dr. Yunus were starting by the government. The reason I bring that up in this capital, this time, and in this context is because what the U.S. does has long-term implications. Very happy to see a fellow human rights advocate and a lawyer here, because how we choose to respond to things, whether we continue to have these sanctions or not, will have a direct impact. And so I'm extremely heartened by our congressional leaders who very specifically tie not only what's happening in Bangladesh to what's happening here in America today, around the block and around in the room, but also really what's happening in terms of, in the context of Bangladesh. At the time, I had worked for Dr. Yunus in 1993, to date myself. I'm as old as Bangladesh, I should admit. And so, my first boss, I remember being alarmed, like what were all these attacks that were happening against him? And a very good friend said to me, Mo, you can't afford to get involved in this fight. And this is someone who very smart, very well-intentioned, very senior in government and very wise. And the reason he said it is because I had something to lose. We had moved to Bangladesh for my husband's business, and their business could actually lose licenses. At that time, this is something that we now, 10, 15 years later, we can actually appreciate, but this is related to the role of private sector and the government and in terms of what the international roles can play. And so I had to take a back road, and I'm not very much of a revolutionary except in my heart. So I wanted to understand how better to kind of bring hearts and minds together. But at this time, the U.S. government made a tactical decision. The decision the U.S. government took was to take a hands-off approach. And at that time, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina knew she had India at her back. And so she went all in against Dr. Yunus, against a lot of these movements. And the reason I mention that, not just because I was an intern and a disciple of the whole, working at Grameen, etc., but really because it had ramifications of where she knew how much she could push. Those 10, 15 years, what we do today, the policymakers, the staff who are here, it is so important for you to understand that one small thing, what you do or do not do, what you say or do not say, has a long-term implications, not just for Bangladesh, but for the region. And I'll come back into what the question you're asking me, but the regional implications, the geopolitical regional implications of what happens in Bangladesh is not just because it's the 8th largest country in the world. As my mom always says, if you don't learn Bangla, someday you're going to realize what it might even be a UN language, she says. I'm not sure about that, but it did, there is a UN movement in terms of the language movement and International Mother's Language Day on February 21st. But in terms of actually the role the government now has we talked about how this protest started. The protest started because of unemployment. The protest started because there was economic disparity. That's why I know for sure Trump was elected in my home state of Michigan, because people felt disenfranchised. I know that there's economics is the heart of many political what happens in politics. And if this government is going to make a change, is going to sustain some of that spirit of what happened, then I would urge that we look at the 3 Greek issues, I, D, and C. Infrastructure investment, D as in digitalization, deregulation, and also diplomacy, and C as in connectivity, corridors, and cooperation. So first, let's look at the first I, infrastructure. as ADB, World Bank, others have made fundamental improvements and investments in Bangladesh to improve their roads and their highways, and they're really prioritizing. I just was very lucky to meet with my colleagues at the ADB just yesterday, or actually 2 days ago, I guess, since I was flying, where they talked about the new the country partnership strategy for ADB and Bangladesh. That partnership is going to rest on two pillars, really looking at diversification of the economy and really to buttress against any kind of headwinds of if there's going to be a with LDC graduation, with also kind of the shocks of the environment, of the shocks of all of the COVID, post-COVID, all of these things, and then lastly looking at improving cooperation in the region. So the government will have a very strong role to play in terms of having strong infrastructure to allow these economic things for these people to have jobs and to have connectivity. And then secondly, in terms of the multilateral development banks, their job will to be playing a role of not just funding, but in partnership with the government as a knowledge partner, as a funder, and to provide oversight. And here I want to emphasize the importance of governance, where MDBs can play a very important role. In fact, they must play a role. And where the U.S. is the largest shareholder in many of these MDBs has to play a very important role, is that if we don't actually see what governance, if we're investing into vaccine factories that happen to be in a certain region because someone lives there, but there's no local capacity to actually do that, or that vaccine entity will be done with a very corrupt local health entity, which is exactly what happened in the past, then that is something that we have to understand as part of a larger, development story of a country like Bangladesh. So MDBs have not just a fundraising and a technical assistance role, but also a governance, oversight, and funding enabling role. Lastly, in terms of private sector, I think we were discussing, and I'm sure we can get into a lot of this later, and I'm sure I'm probably going to be at time, so I'll just say a couple of things about this. The private sector has to be key to what's happening, because the private sector, and as much as I very much always agree with Dina Siddiqui, I would really urge us to reconsider how important FDI is. Foreign direct investment is critical to Bangladesh today and Bangladesh tomorrow. It is critical to Bangladesh today and Bangladesh tomorrow. And the reason it's critical is because Bangladesh is amongst the lowest FDIs as well as the lowest taxes in the region compared to its GDP, compared to its, everything else. If those two rates don't increase, Bangladesh actually cannot maintain the growth and the hopes of people like Orni and others who sacrifice for this country. So the private sector, I can get a lot into it, some of the barriers to it, some of the banking sector, all of that. Hopefully some of that will come up in the questions. But I want to end with those 3 points. The importance of the government, the importance of multilateral development banks, the importance of the private sector to sustain and to carry on the spirit of what the people of Bangladesh actually started, and the important role the U.S. government and U.S. policymakers here and always have a role to play in that.
Thank you, Martin. Excellent remarks, and I think you tied with foreign policy issues that came up earlier very well to the economic issues and how these economic arrangements are so key to approaching these partners around the world too. Going now to the Shamil Hub, I'm going to come to you really to focus a bit on the future, because we all know that BNP is sort of leading in the polls for the elections. So there are questions about what is the BNP's vision for foreign policy as well, and we're talking about Bangladesh in the world. So as you're sort of consulting with various people within the party, like what are some of the main focus areas for Bangladesh's relationship with the U.S. If the BNP is to assume office next year, as well as with India?
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the organizers here. First, in true Bangladeshi style, I'll start with a caveat. I am only an observer, not affiliated in any way, and had the good fortune to volunteer at some points, and can only speak from that vantage. So I think the tricky thing for BNP is that if and when, under a free and fair election, it takes power, for it'll be, whichever year the election happens, maybe 2026, we're hoping. But it'll also be starting from 2006, the last year when BNP was in power. And the government had taken some steps which had coalesced various regional and international forces to to think that a BNP government would not be in its best interest going forward. And that is what it needs to handle if and when it comes to power next. And I think when we talk about the struggle against Sheikh Hasina and her 15-year rule, there are many entry points where we can start the narrative. But the one I always jump to is 2021. The world is sort of, recovering from COVID. Bangladesh has just had an election in 2018, following another fraudulent election in 2014, which Ambassador Mutina here and John got to see from the front rows, and I'm sure had some thoughts about. And the tricky thing about Sheikh Hasina was that she was a master of form over substance. You try to go to someone and explain there is opposition. You have rallies, so, what's going on? And it would really take someone who was invested in Bangladesh to get the horror and the lived experience of facing oppression under RAB, which, my friend from the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Center mentioned. The state security apparatus, the digital policing, and really speak up for human rights and democracy. So after 2018, another sham election takes place. In 2021, we get the Magnitsky sanctions against RAB. And that really represented a sea change in that we had become used to seeing the Hasina regime acting with complete disregard for law, norms, governance, regulations, and still go abroad and get recognition at UN functions, be treated as a serious partner in world capitals. And in 2021, those sanctions, I think, sent a message that no, the world was taking notice, there was a rupture, this was not how things were supposed to be. And then, the great work by the Biden administration in focusing attention on the elections that would take place in Bangladesh was really heartening to the diaspora in the US and around the world in sort of coalescing and sort of trying to make sure that this time our voices would be heard. The 2024 election was, another triumph of form over substance. Sheikh Hasina had gotten emboldened to such an extent she wanted to have her party people be the opposition and the governing party. And that sort of set the stage for what we saw a year earlier in July and August, where finally we could go to the world and show what was going on. That people are being shot in the streets for, demanding their God-given rights, for demanding their constitutional rights. So with that context, I think a lot of what I said now pertains to Bangladesh's relationship with the US, that Bangladesh has looked to the US as a font of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. While the fidelity to those may be shift from time to time, I think the long-term trend does not waver. We all have a very favorite saying, the struggle of mankind against tyranny is the struggle of memory versus forgetting. And it's very important we don't forget the road that led us to last July and August, and the fact that we are sitting here in the Capitol Visitors Center and talking about democracy in Bangladesh now. For India, I think there is, I mean, not to be too dramatic about it, but there's a huge upside to Bangladesh and India elections under the next elected government, taking small confidence-building measures and sort of, moving to a place where things can be accentuated on a basis of mutual gain and mutual respect. I'll share a small anecdote. In October 2023, 3 months before the elections, Hasina launched a brutal crackdown arrested what we like to call the usual suspects, the senior leadership of the pro-democracy movements. One of the almost last things BNP did before that was to put out its India-Pacific strategy, where it talked in detail about how it saw the world being going forward. And it made very clear its commitment to the rule of law, a law-based system in and around the Pacific, and the fact that Bangladesh had to throw its lot with the democracies of Asia and the West. And then I think what Michael mentioned very succinctly is the relationship with Myanmar. And I think there's a sense right now, just with everything going on in the world, that national borders don't mean as much as they used to. Drones are flying in, bombs are being exploded in places very far away from borders. So Bangladesh needs to be very careful about the situation with Myanmar and proceed in a way that reflects an all-party consensus. Michael raised a very good point that regarding Bangladesh, there's an all-party consensus in India. So not only BJP, but the Indian National Congress and other parties were all unanimous that the fallen dictator Sheikh Hasina be treated as a favored guest in India, be kept, in a VIP villa and given a lavish life. I think it's in the best interest of Bangladesh as well to coalesce and have an all-party consensus on these very important issues going forward. Coming to an end, whenever I would speak to the pro-democracy activists in Bangladesh and ask them, what can we do for you? The answer would always be the same. Tell our story, talk about us, let the world know that we are fighting for these things, that the world says it values, and they should, stand up and count for us. And Representatives Doggett and McGovern were signatories in so many letters highlighting the situation in Bangladesh in 2021, 2022, 2023. They deserve a big vote of thanks from us. And I'd like to think that all of us in this room can be sort of the stakeholders and coalition for preserving the movement that toppled the dictatorship last year and brought democracy back to Bangladesh. And, I want to end in a note of positivity. We are immeasurably better off than we were a year ago, and I hope we can all build on that. Thank you.
I'd love for our volunteers to start collecting questions from the audience, and if you're still writing your questions, feel free to take your time to write them as it goes around. And thank you everyone for your initial remarks. I think we covered a lot of ground. I hope some good questions come up. One broad question I had for anyone who'd like to take it is obviously, Bangladesh is leaning in a lot with its relationship with China, and that's is something that the U.S. is tracking very closely on the Hill. And I think that there are certain U.S. views, no matter the administration here, about kind of countries in the region having stronger or weaker relationships with China. So would love to hear your thoughts about how you see that relationship and what are some of the pros and cons, and in terms of human rights issues too, that comes up quite a bit as well in the context of China's involvement in Africa. So would love for you to take a broader view at economic issues, but also broader governance and human rights issues. And Ambassador Mosina, you wanted to underscore the development success story of Bangladesh, and you've done that many times when you were there as ambassador as well. So now that the USAID has kind of folded, there's really not too many mechanisms for the US government to engage on development issues in Bangladesh. I'm wondering, beyond trade, which we're kind of in a waiting mode for that, what do you see as some of the mechanisms for engaging on development issues? Do you also see a role for the non-government players in that space? If you could talk a little bit about that. And Michael, would love to come to you later about expanding on the Myanmar question and what that means for the U.S. as well, because that is another issue I know on the Hill there's a lot of concern about, and they're tracking it very closely. So any kind of direction that you see it going, and broader implications for the region. So anyone want to tackle the China question?
I can take that. So, I mean, just as Michael said very well, I think that, Bangladesh has really tried to maintain, particularly now, more transactional and kind of non-aligned and as needed relationships. But the fact is China has played a very oversized role in terms of investment and infrastructure development and their roads and initiatives. I mean, there was a big, in fact, I remember meeting with a Bangladesh government official previously who said, U.S., if you don't step up, we're forced to go to China, because they are offering aid. And so I think, again, this is something for us to think about when we do policies that really almost necessitate that leaders go to China or organizations go to China. I think that's something that's worth thinking about. But at the same time, I want to step back and have a more nuanced view on this. As an American board member, I remember visiting some projects in Central Asia where the U.S. actually designed the projects and Chinese constructed. It was an excellent project. So I think I would not want to be someone who's just anti-China across the board, but at least have a more nuanced view in why it is that oftentimes China will not give jobs to the local community or it's the lowest bidder, but not really the best value, but it's not the best quality. There are lots of number of reasons which I know as policymakers we have to think about, but which politically are not very popular or very understandable. So I think we actually owe it to our constituents, whoever they are, to explain some of that nuance. So I think the reason I wanted to take that first step in the China question is it's not as simple as China or India or China or not or China or US. It's much more nuanced, and particularly in a country like Bangladesh where there's also such a predominance of Chinese investment already. This is really something that you can't overthrow. Or like when I moved to the Philippines, I remember someone took me aside. He goes, what you Americans don't understand is after you leave, China will still be here. We can't forget our neighbors. So I think that this is something that is really worth bearing in mind. But the last point about how this particular government, keeping in mind it's an interim government, has chosen to work with China is really, I would really give it a lot of appreciation. It's been more nuanced, it's been more diplomatic, and it's been very explicitly, this is what we need, this is what we want, and rather than a hedging the bets or kind of trying to play one off the other. And I really appreciate the government for doing that. And I don't say that in any partisan way, but it's from an observation and a comparison to previously what I've seen. So it's not all or nothing, but more nuanced.
I would like to add to that. I think Moshumi really hit the nail right on the head, and I echo those thoughts. I think America should not obsess on Bangladesh's engagement with China. Bangladesh should do what every sovereign nation on this planet should do, advance its own interests. And America should accept that Bangladesh, in engaging with China, is seeking to advance its own interests. I think instead, America, Washington, should obsess on itself. How can we best advance our interests vis-a-vis Bangladesh? And I think we have a lot more thinking to do on that front. I hit some of those points in my remarks. We need to realize that strengthening our bilateral relationship with Bangladesh is in our interest, America's interest, and we need to forge ahead.
One question or other questions too?
Yeah, I would agree with that. There has been some discussion, and I'm not sure if we should place too much importance in this. There has been some discussion on the impact, the geopolitical great power competition implications of USA no longer being a thing, and what that could mean for Bangladesh. And there's been some discussion that this is something that is essentially a vacuum that China could fill. There might be some truth to that, but those of us, you all know Bangladesh well, know that there's a very large. Bangladesh has been able to cooperate with a number of bilateral and multilateral donors over the years. So it's not so simple as USA no longer being there, China is going to capitalize. I think there's a tendency to look at these types of issues from a zero-sum lens, just because of how intense U.S.-China competition has been. I'm not saying it's not important to think about these broader geopolitical implications of the end of US aid, but I think that we should look at it in a proper, broader context. I could quickly address your question about Myanmar. I don't really have that much more to say about it. It's such a complex issue. I'm not an expert on Myanmar, so I won't delve into it. I do know that Bangladesh officials had looked to this very complex challenge with Myanmar and the border and the conflict in Myanmar and so on as a possible way to get the attention of the Trump administration as to why it's important to engage with Bangladesh. And I think there's something to that, but this is an administration that, as we've discussed, wants to be less involved in the world, not more involved, particularly when it comes to conflict and instability. China is indeed trying to get more involved in Rohingya repatriation talks, mediating them. There's been some history to that. That might get the attention of the administration, but I suspect that at the end of the day, the current government here would be a bit uneasy about delving into an issue as complex and tricky as the Bangladesh-Myanmar border issue.
Thank you for the comments. We did receive a number of questions. I'm not sure we'll have time to cover all of the questions here, but I'm trying to group them together a little bit. But there are specific questions for each of you from the audience. So I'll come to Moshmi first. One of the questions is, authoritarian regimes like Hasina's also lends legitimacy to NDBs, like essentially the global actors, multilateral organizations, and in terms of their involvement in issues around governance and human rights, how can we make sure that future governments are more accountable? And then moving on to, I'll pass this to you to take a look at. Ambassador Mosina, I think a specific question for you is in terms of the China-India talks earlier this week, what are the implications in terms of the kind of the connection between the foreign policy of these two countries and how the U.S. is approaching Bangladesh? So if there's a kind of, I assume it's about the tighter relationship between India and China. It came from Ambassador Yusuf. And how do you view that? And then for Michael, a few of these questions have already been covered, but one of the different ones is focused on ASEAN and potential for Bangladesh to play a role within the ASEAN as well. And Ehtisham, for you, there are a few questions. I'll pass this to you, but in terms of the July uprising, this is a bit straying from the foreign policy discussion, but the question is really about BNP's reform agenda and coming to some consensus ahead of the elections and in terms of its vision for rebuilding after the election as well. So if I can pass these to Ehtisham. And we need to wrap in about 5 to 6 minutes, so if you could keep your responses somewhat concise. Moshmi?
So I think it was an excellent question. And in fact, this is something that was a very big pet issue of mine as I was leaving the board. I raised this issue specifically, and the three responses, the ways to deal with this were internally. So there's an internal due diligence process, and we have an office of OAI and ADB, for example. For example, in the vaccine, one of the things that happened is they required more due diligence. It's an internal process. An external process, sorry for speaking so fast, but external process is stakeholders. Again, U.S. being the largest shareholder, we have to be demand driven and say where are we investing our money, and it should align along in terms of our own agenda and our own geopolitics. But lastly, it has to be within the MDBs themselves. When we say there's an inherent kind of disconnect and a perverse incentive to say we're a sovereign lender. Well, this is a sovereign leader, so we must lend, but we can't because if we're not protecting our investment, it's our taxpayer money, it's our shareholding money. This is something that I would say that MDBs have to really reevaluate in terms of their own good governance. So.
Ambassador Mosina or Michael, would you like to take one of your questions directed at you, or?
This one is a bit complicated. If there is no significant change in U.S. policy toward the world in general, has the conventional understanding of Bangladesh seen through the lens of its big neighbors by the West or USA in particular been changed? If so, to what extent? I think I have to come back to what I was saying earlier, that Bangladesh rightly has to pursue its own interests. And so I don't know about looking at different lens. I don't see it that way. I hope that the Bangladesh that emerges, be it a BNP government or something else, I hope that it will not fall into the trap of trying to do the things that Hasina was playing with, all the different machinations that she was doing with India in particular, and instead just focus on advancing its interests. This is critical, advancing its own interests, short-term, medium-term, long-term. That's what it should do. And one of the most frustrating times in my ambassadorship in Bangladesh was going to India, having this very conversation about might say audaciously to the Indians, the importance of their medium and long-term interests to staying. Don't pick winners in Bangladesh. And behind the closed door, of course, everybody agreed. And as soon as they got in front of a microphone, they trashed me, as some of you will remember. But now I think those chickens are coming home to roost in an unhelpful way for Delhi.
Thank you. We are going a little bit over time, but I want to give 2 minutes to each of you to respond to the questions. Sham and Michael.
So I want to acknowledge all 3 questions and then maybe answer at once. First question is about the recent brutal murder in Midford involving activists, BNP activists on both sides. What would be consequence if Jamaat forms the next government of Bangladesh? And what is BNP's role in helping the reform? So I think we need to acknowledge that there is a deep need for reform and expectation that things will not continue as usual. It won't be business as usual. BNP can cite to the fact that it started the reform talk way back with a 31-point movement where, amongst other things, it mentioned the upper house, but it needs to, I think, assure a large part of the domestic and international audience that things can't be business as usual. It can't be the same people from 2001 to 6 and the same mindset running things, and they will rise to, grab the spirit of the moment. Regarding potentially Jamaat forming the next government, I think we all have to ask from the democratic parties that they respect the same free and fair election model through which they get into power, which is what Hasina didn't do in 2009 and 10. First thing she did after coming to power was get rid of the caretaker government. As long as that main basic bulwark stays against, autocracy, I think you have to let the people speak and respect their votes, wherever that may lead. Thank you.
Michael, very quickly.
Yeah, I don't want to be the one keeping us from the refreshments. Yeah, some questions about the China-Bangladesh-U.S. triangle. And one key question, would stronger Bangladesh-China relations prompt the U.S. to give more prioritization to Bangladesh? I think it's a good point. And I think the answer might be yes. I think we could agree that this administration will largely view Bangladesh through a commercial lens, and we've seen that with trade and tariffs and all. But I think that the great power competition factor will loom large here as well. A big part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, which Trump's first administration came out with, was to ensure that the U.S. has good enough ties with countries around the region that they don't feel compelled to rely wholly on China. Not something that Bangladesh is going to do, given that it's really diversified its sources of economic and commercial partners. But I do think that if there's an indication that Bangladesh is starting to really ramp up its engagement with China, that could get this administration's attention. But that brings me to another point very quickly. When you look at the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship, what could really help move the relationship forward within the context of this very unconventional administration? I identify an initiative, an entity that I've noted many times before, the DFC, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. It's been around for a while. It's meant to be a tool of the Indo-Pacific policy. It's meant to advance U.S. goals by sponsoring infrastructure projects to push back against China. DFC cannot operate in Bangladesh, as you know, because of labor concerns. So if that were to change, if, first of all, the DFC still has to be reauthorized here on the Hill. If it is, and if we get to a point where U.S. officials no longer felt that labor conditions were bad enough that you couldn't have DFC operating in Bangladesh, I actually think the DFC could be a really useful tool to help advance U.S.-Bangladesh relations. DFC is a large portfolio in India. It briefly tried to do something in Sri Lanka, as many of you will know, with the Adani company that didn't work out. But DFC, I think, is something to keep in mind if conditions change to allow it to operate in Bangladesh, given labor concerns.
Thank you. That was very concise and helpful. We're going to move into some key takeaways, so I won't actually wrap up the main points from the panel because Saif will be doing that in a second. But thank you for this extremely engaging discussion. There's so much to talk about, and I know that we can continue the conversation over lunch, so I hope you can stick around. And thank you to the organizers, Bangladesh America Alliance, BRAIN, and Right to Freedom for really championing this program here a year later, a really timely program, and thanks to all the guests for coming. So with that, can we have a hand for the panelists?
Thanks, Shamru. As most of you know, I was Deputy Chief of Mission at our embassy in Dhaka, and the Deputy Chief of Mission has to be the one who's the bad guy. So that's why I played the role of bad guy today, so I apologize to everyone. But first, thanks everyone for sticking through. I mean, it's remarkable the amount of you who've been able to stay the whole time. We've got 3 more things to do today, and the first 2 are going to be brief. So Saif Shah Mohammed from BRAIN is going to give us his thoughts on kind of big picture key takeaways from today's discussions. Casey Kausar-Chowdhury from the Bangladesh America Alliance is going to give us some thoughts on where we go from here. And then we have some time for networking. He'll kick us out of this room around 1:30, but afterwards I hope we can all take some time to get to know each other a little bit better. Maybe have some refreshments, have some big conversations, some adda, and then kind of keep it going forward. So, Saif, over to you.
So I'm going to keep it really brief. We don't want to keep people away from the food, and people know that you can't keep the Bangladeshis away from Vedanta. So we want you guys to have a Vedanta after this. We've just going over these 2 panels very briefly. We've talked about the journey that we've been on. We've talked about the bravery and the courage that Penny showed at that moment in July last year, and also the trauma of that moment. We heard very personally from our people, and just how much it impacted, not only just generation, but also sort of, about the way the Bangladeshis will look back at who they are as a people, right? And so, this is a big thing, right? But we're also at this moment where, there are challenges. We've talked about the challenges a lot. We've talked about sort of, the wonderful scenes of people coming together immediately after the revolution, people talking about being able to talk freely, but also this moment where people are having difficulty in coming together and coming to some kind of democratic settlement. Potential backsliding, questions about when elections are going to be, questions about what, these institutional reforms are going to look like. We've also talked about sort of not all of this being bad news, right? Because people are actually talking to each other. And, there was actually scope for people coming up with new ideas. And some of these ideas we've heard, right? So, there's a lot in there to unpack. But I think the important takeaway here is that this is, as Ambassador Muzima said, a very fluid moment, globally, but also within Bangladesh. And this is, in some ways, a moment where you look at it and say, oh my God, there's so many dangers, but you also look at it and say, there's so much opportunity, right? And if there's one takeaway to take out of this, is something that I think that Ektam said in the last, we're immeasurably that there is a moment that has some magic to be captured, which is why we're all here. Now, we can talk about that, of course, in this, we build, all of our hopes on those hopes, but, there are specific things that came out of these 2 panels. One, of course, there was a recognition in a couple of the speakers made about, the importance that, both U.S. action and U.S. inaction has had on both events over the last 15 years, as well as where things are today, right? And we've talked about, for example, the importance of the Domestic sanctions, talk about the UN peacekeeping forces. So those are kinds of sticks that are, still levers, I think, that are out there, right? But I don't think that any of us want to think about this moment in terms of like, what are, pressures that can be put. I mean, that's not the spirit of the moment. And I don't think that would be, I think, the sense I've gotten from at least the conversations that we've had is that, we've got to also let the Bangladeshi people lead themselves, right? And create the space for it. There are things that the U.S. can do. We've talked about sort of like the difficulties that are coming up with both the USAID money that's support that's disappeared, as well as the trade negotiations that are going on right now. And if things don't work out that we want them to work out, that really you have some very, very big challenges, particularly for the vast population that depends upon the money that comes from the income that's generated by the energy sector. Those are, of course, things that we need the help of policymakers on, right? There's also technical support. Catherine talked about sort of the work that we've done, sort of, the challenges in some ways on the human rights front, and making sure that the Bangladeshi government, both the interim government and whatever follows, sort of approaches these things in the right way. So we actually have accountability in the international sphere for some of the crimes that have been committed, right? And so that we don't, and some of, there's been positive things, right, that this government, that this interim government's done. I think the technical support there is going to be helpful. Moshe talked about FDI. I think there is incredible amount of work to be done. Ambassador Musina, again, I go back to sort of like this idea of this being a fluid moment. We can think about these as challenges, but there's also a question of, there are opportunities, right? And I think that's a two-way thing. That's a two-way conversation, which this, I think, is part of the beginnings of. Bangladesh has to make a case for itself. Bangladesh has to talk about why it's important in the current moment. And Bangladesh has to make a case for why it deserves, in some ways, or is owed, in some ways, the support of U.S. policymakers, U.S. government, so on and so forth. And just sitting back and hoping that it's going to happen is not going to cut it, right? But on the other hand, I think there is also recognition that I've heard from the congressman that spoke that there is a recognition of Bangladesh being more than just a piece of this broader puzzle of, Southeast Asia, and the broader geopolitical, calculations that are going on over there. Bangladesh in itself is the most populous country in the world, and that in itself, creates the need for attention that is important. I think, you recognize when you're looking around Bangladesh that, we're a very young society. We've talked about this revolution as a youth movement, right? This is a young society, and they're paying attention, right? And like any young people, they're trying to figure out who they are and where do they stand in the world. And they're paying attention at a time when there are competing noises around them. And the better support they get, that is what they will remember for the rest of their lives. There is a danger in this moment that this journey turns into some kind of cynicism, that turns into some kind of desperation. And we really, really desperately need to avoid that. Because that would be not only sort of a betrayal of the promise of that moment, but also, potentially, very, very cynically, if you will, dangerous for what it portends for that region, right? And I think we ought to recognize that. That's number one. The second thing we ought to recognize is that, in spite of that, there are conversations that are happening, right? And there has been an opening of space in politically, but also in civil society. And, people are talking. There is a robust discussion about, what a government should look like, what accountability should be. And those are messy discussions, as they ought to be, because there are never any clear answers. And that's a good thing. We hope that, platforms like this, discussions such as this, can continue and have more of them. I think one of the things I heard was that there really should be more panels of this nature in the future. I'll take, to sort of close this out, I'll take a moment to talk a little bit about BRAIN, just plug a little bit what we do. One of the reasons where I got involved is because, it really is an attempt at deepening as well as broadening the discourse within Bangladesh, right, as well as, among the diaspora community. Very, very quickly, among the things that we've done, we've had seminars within Bangladesh and beyond about, topics of economics, topics of urban transportation. There is a podcast that John and Dr. Supan are actually starting in the coming weeks that we hope you'll be sort of listening in on. And we're trying to connect a broader range of voices that have been put forward so far, right? And there's also a panel, there's actually work being done on creating spaces for women in the public sphere in Bangladesh. So I think, those kinds of things, it cannot be the only platform. The Bangladesh-American Alliance, I think, is another one of those platforms. We love the support we're getting from Dr. Freedom. There's many, many others. We encourage you to engage. I think one of the things that Dina said was that delve below the surface and talk to us. There's a lot of voices there. We love talking. We're people of Dhaka. And so I encourage you to come and talk to us and really try to engage with this country of 170 million people who created this moment of hope and created this moment of tremendous change in spite of all the challenges.
Okay, thank you.
120 seconds.
So, good afternoon, everybody. We just should be thanking Time Television for their live broadcasting via streaming. We channels are there streaming on YouTube and Facebook. So with that, I'd like to start my little speech. So today, many have spoken about the crisis we have faced. But as we close this gathering, I want to shift focus from challenge to possibility, from reaction to reinvention. Because resilience is not enough, we need reinvention, rooted in economic sovereignty, democratic values, and strategic partnership between Bangladesh and the United States. Our objective is disarmingly simple, yet profoundly revolutionary. To cultivate a trade relationship that is not extractive, but inherently expansive. A relationship that is not merely transactional, but transformative. As co-chair of the Bangladesh-America Alliance, I have watched Bangladesh's stories evolve. Born during the July 2024 revolution, our fledgling alliance fought against disinformation. And now with truth gaining ground, we are focused on building stronger economic, commercial, and institutional bridges. Let's be clear, Bangladesh is no longer the basket case of history. It is a nation on track for LDC graduation, importing heavily, expanding industrially, and aligning with democratic governance. Because when rights are protected and laws are transparent, economies thrive. That's the future Bangladesh seeks, with the US as a committed partner. For too long, prohibitive trade policies by the previous Bangladesh regime limited what was possible. The double fumigation rule on US cotton was one example, hurting both sides. Today, things are changing. The interim government has opened the door to bonded warehouses for US cotton suppliers, cutting the lead time and creating the chance to more than double US market share in Bangladesh. This is a win-win. Bangladesh gains efficiency, American growers gain access. That's the spirit of what we call commodity diplomacy. Not just fixing broken systems, but building more new ones. We hope to work closely with the Congressional Bangladesh Caucus, American industry, and Bangladeshi trade bodies to turn these ideas into results. Let me offer 4 areas where collaboration can be transformational. Textiles. With bonded warehousing in place, how can US cotton suppliers form direct, traceable partnerships with Bangladeshi manufacturers, enhancing both ethical sourcing and US competitiveness? 2. Food security. Bangladesh remains heavily reliant on wheat and corn imports. What investment incentives can we explore to expand US agricultural exports while building stable, resilient supply chains in the region? Energy. With Bangladesh's industrial demand surging, there is a 900 million annual opportunity for the US LNG and renewable power providers. This is an open door for long-term energy partnerships. Defense. Bangladesh's Air Force remains dependent on aging Chinese F-7s. There's a real scope for modernization, starting with advanced US platforms like the F-16. This isn't just a defense hardware, it's regional security cooperation, interoperability with allies, and a multi-billion-dollar economic opportunity for the US defense. It means high-tech jobs in America and greater strategic alignment in the Indo-Pacific. But our greatest shared asset isn't material, it's human. Each year, over 17,000 Bangladeshis in the US study in the US, contributing an estimated $680 million annually to the US economy. That's tuition, housing, transportation, local spending, all supporting American jobs and small businesses. But here's the missed opportunity. If we scale that number to 52,000 students, on par with other key partners like India, the United States could gain over $2.2 billion annually in direct economic activity. That's a win for universities, local communities, and the broader economy. This is not a brain drain, it's a brain bridge, and it is one we must widen. Finally, my deepest thanks to our moderators, Farhana Sultana, Shamrukh Moeddin, our panelists, and our partners at RTF and BRAIN, and the media here today. Many of us stand with a foot in each wall, the land that gave us our roots, and the land that gave us wings. We owe both a better future. Let's build it together with purpose, with urgency, and with unity. Thank you. Let's get to work.
Okay, well, that concludes today's program, and hopefully it concludes the live stream, the broadcast as well. So now we can mingle, get to know each other a little bit better, and there's some modest refreshments available for those who are interested. So thank you very much, and until the next time.
Can we all get a round of applause?
Great job. Amazing job.
Thank you.